Hello everyone, tonight I've got 15 special scary stories for all of you. I know many of you watch these videos to fall asleep, so before that, make sure to like the video and subscribe to Creepy Sinister, and don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're from and what time you're watching. Now get comfortable and let's begin. Story 1. It was the first night in a cheap roadside motel during a storm I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I had been driving for about 14 hours straight that day, trying to make the long trip from Ohio to Colorado in just a couple of days. The rain had started around 9 o'clock that evening, just a light, annoying drizzle at first, but by 11:30 p.m. it had turned into an absolute, massive downpour. The windshield wipers on my car couldn't even come close to keeping up with the sheer volume of water. The dark highway was getting dangerously hard to navigate, and the reflection of my headlights on the wet asphalt was practically blinding me. I knew I needed to pull over and get some sleep before I ended up in a ditch. I took the very next exit I saw, which led me down a dark, empty, winding county road. A few miles down that isolated stretch, a flickering red neon sign finally cut through the heavy sheet of rain. It just said motel, with half the letters completely burnt out and buzzing loudly. I pulled my car into the cracked parking lot. There were only 2 other vehicles there, parked all the way on the opposite side of the long building. The place looked incredibly old and neglected, like it hadn't been updated or cared for since the 1970s. The paint on the exterior walls was visibly peeling off in strips, and the wooden overhang above the main office was noticeably sagging. I ran through the freezing rain into the lobby. The guy working behind the small front counter barely even looked up from his phone when I asked for a room for the night. He just nodded, took my cash, and handed me a physical brass key attached to a heavy, faded plastic tag. Room 214. I grabbed my duffel bag from the passenger seat of my car and headed up the exterior, weather-beaten concrete stairs to the second floor. The walkway outside the rooms was technically covered, but the wind was blowing the rain violently sideways, completely soaking my jeans before I could even get my heavy door open. I pushed the door to room 214 open and blindly reached for the light switch. The single overhead light buzzed to life, casting a very dim, sickly yellowish glow over the entire space. It smelled heavily of old, stale cigarettes mixed with strong, cheap cleaning chemicals. It wasn't exactly a comfortable place, but it was dry, and I was so exhausted I barely cared. I turned the deadbolt until it clicked, threw my wet bag onto the nearest chair, and sat down hard on the edge of the incredibly stiff bed. The room itself was very small and cramped. There was a cheap, chipped wooden desk against the wall, an old box television sitting on a dresser, and one single, wide window located right next to the bed. The window overlooked the dark parking lot and the empty black highway way off in the distance. Heavy faded floral curtains were pulled back on either side, held tightly by small metal hooks screwed into the wall. The rain was hitting the glass incredibly hard. It made a constant, loud, erratic tapping sound that echoed throughout the small room. I remember sitting there, listening to it, thinking it sounded almost exactly like fingernails tapping aggressively against the glass. I actually reached out and touched the pane just to feel it. It was freezing cold against my fingertips. I pulled the heavy floral curtains completely shut to block out the harsh red glow from the neon sign outside, just hoping to get some real, uninterrupted rest. I went into the tiny bathroom, splashed some warm water on my tired face, and brushed my teeth. I just wanted to sleep and get out of there as early as possible the next morning. I walked back out, turned off the main overhead lights, and left only the bathroom light on with the door cracked open a few inches, just to have a little bit of visibility in the unfamiliar room. I crawled under the thin, scratchy blanket and closed my eyes. The rhythmic sound of the heavy storm outside was actually kind of relaxing at first, just the constant, heavy rain and the occasional deep roll of distant thunder shaking the walls. I slowly started to drift off into a deep sleep. I don't know exactly how much time passed while I was out. It must have been around 1:15 a.m. when I finally woke up. I didn't jolt awake in a panic or anything like that. I just sort of drifted out of sleep because something in the room felt distinctly different. The air around me had physically changed. It was noticeably colder, much colder than it had been when I laid down. And the stale smell of the old room had been entirely replaced by the sharp, metallic smell of wet asphalt and fresh rain. I opened my heavy eyes and looked over toward the window right next to my bed. The heavy floral curtains were moving in the dark. The wind was physically blowing them inward, rustling the thick fabric against the cheap wallpaper. I sat up in bed, completely confused and rubbing my eyes. I knew for an absolute fact the window had been closed when I laid down to sleep. The glass had been completely flush against the aluminum frame, but right then it was open about 6 inches. I figured the old latch must have been broken, and the incredibly strong wind outside had somehow rattled the pane loose and slid it open along its track. It was a rundown motel, so things falling apart wasn't exactly a massive shock to me. I shivered violently as a cold, wet gust of wind hit my face. I reached over, grabbed the cold metal handle of the window, and forcefully slid it completely shut. It made a loud, awful scraping noise against the dirty metal track. I pushed the little locking mechanism down until I felt and heard a distinct, solid click. I even gave the window a firm, hard tug just to make absolutely sure it was secure. It didn't budge an inch. Satisfied, I pulled the heavy curtains tightly shut again, tucked the thin blanket right up around my shoulders, and laid back down on the uncomfortable mattress. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to force myself back into a deep sleep, but that awful feeling of being watched slowly started to creep over me in the dark. You know that heavy, sinking feeling in your chest when your instincts just tell you that you aren't alone in a room? I kept trying to brush it off. I kept telling myself it was just the creepy atmosphere of the motel and the total isolation getting to my head. I focused on the tapping sound of the rain against the glass. Just rain, I told myself over and over. Just water hitting the window, nothing else. About an entire hour slowly went by like that. I was stuck in that weird, frustrating middle state where you are half asleep but still entirely aware of your surroundings. The storm was still raging violently outside, rattling the walls, and then I heard it clearly, a slow, heavy, grinding scrape. It was the exact same awful sound the window had made when I closed it earlier, metal dragging harshly against the old aluminum track. My eyes snapped open instantly. I didn't move a single muscle in my body. I just lay there and stared directly at the curtains. Through the narrow, vertical gap where the curtains met in the middle, I could clearly see that the window was open again. It wasn't just a little bit this time either. It was open almost halfway. The freezing cold air was pouring rapidly into the room, bringing a fine mist of rain right along with it. My heart started pounding violently against my ribs. I knew without a doubt I had locked it. I vividly remembered hearing the metal mechanism click firmly into place. Wind simply does not unlock a heavy metal latch and physically slide a heavy window horizontally against its track. I slowly sat up, letting the thin blanket fall down to my waist. I reached out with a very shaky hand and pulled the heavy curtain back just a few inches. The window was wide open to the violent, stormy night. I leaned a little closer, looking out into the pitch-black parking lot below. Nothing, just the heavy rain falling through the eerie red glow of the flickering neon sign. I couldn't see anyone standing down there at all, and we were on the second floor. There was no balcony outside my window, no fire escape, just a straight, flat drop down to the concrete walkway 20 feet below. I grabbed the window frame and slammed it shut, probably way harder than I actually needed to. My hands were visibly shaking at this point. I pushed the metal lock down again, pressing hard until my thumb hurt. This time I wasn't taking any chances at all. I got entirely out of bed and walked over to the cheap wooden desk across the room. I grabbed the heavy, solid wooden chair sitting in front of it. I dragged it all the way over to the window and forcefully wedged the top backrest of the chair directly under the window handle. I jammed the wooden legs as hard as I could against the carpeted floor, creating a very solid, tight wedge. There was absolutely no way that window was sliding open now without knocking the heavy chair completely over and making a massive, unavoidable amount of noise. I stood there for a long minute just staring intensely at my makeshift barricade in the dim light. I felt a little bit ridiculous, to be completely honest. I was a grown adult man hiding from a drafty motel window, but something deep down in my gut was absolutely screaming that this wasn't right. I didn't go back to sleep. I physically couldn't. I sat on the very edge of the bed, wrapped tightly in the thin blanket, just staring blankly at the heavy floral curtains. The minutes dragged by painfully, feeling more like hours. Every single time the wind howled loudly against the building, I flinched. The continuous tapping of the rain against the glass seemed to get progressively louder in the silence. It was no longer a random, chaotic rhythm of weather. It sounded slow and deliberate now. Tap, tap, tap. I tried to mentally convince myself it was just the heavy branches of a nearby tree hitting the glass, even though I knew for a fact there weren't any tall trees anywhere near this side of the parking lot. My eyes were burning badly from exhaustion, but I forced them to stay wide open. It was right around 3:45 a.m. when the ambient temperature in the room plummeted once again. The shift was absolutely immediate and freezing. I stopped breathing. I stared directly at the chair. It hadn't moved an inch, but then right before my own eyes, the heavy floral curtain began to move. It wasn't blowing inward wildly from the wind like before. It was being lifted, slowly and deliberately, from the very bottom corner nearest the bed. It was exactly as if an invisible hand had reached under the heavy fabric and was slowly, carefully pulling it back just to peek inside the room. My blood ran completely cold in my veins. I couldn't speak. I couldn't yell out. I was totally frozen on the edge of the bed. The heavy curtain lifted slightly higher, revealing just the bottom corner of the wet glass, and then I heard it again. The slow, heavy, grinding scrape of metal dragging on metal. The chair didn't fall over. The thick wood just groaned loudly under the intense pressure as the window was forcefully pushed horizontally, dragging the tightly wedged chair a few slow inches across the cheap carpet. The gap in the open window was only a few inches wide now, firmly blocked by the sheer resistance of the chair. I forced my legs to stand up. I don't know where the brief surge of courage even came from, but I desperately needed to know what was on the other side of that glass. I took one slow, hesitant step forward. The curtain instantly dropped back down, falling flat and heavy against the wall. The awful dragging sound immediately stopped. The room went perfectly, terrifyingly still, aside from the muffled, continuous sound of the storm raging outside. I finally reached the window. I hesitated for a brief second, my trembling hand hovering right over the heavy floral fabric. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and forcefully yanked it completely back, exposing the entire window. The window was open a few inches, exactly as I had just heard, but there was absolutely no one standing there. The dark, wet parking lot below was completely empty. The rain was still coming down in heavy sheets. I let out a long, shaky breath I didn't even realize I was holding in. I stepped a little closer to the glass and looked straight down, fully expecting to see someone who had somehow climbed up and was desperately clinging to the narrow brick ledge below the frame. That's when I saw them. I froze completely. My stomach dropped heavily into my shoes. There, pressed firmly against the wet, cold glass on the outside of the window, were handprints. They weren't just vague smudges or weird shadows from the neon sign. They were very distinct, thick, muddy handprints, but they weren't normal human hands. The fingers were impossibly long, unnaturally long, thin, and stretched out. And as I stood there staring at them in absolute, paralyzing horror, the thick mud on the glass actually began to shift. Right in front of my face, a brand new, massive muddy print slowly pressed itself firmly against the glass from out in the dark, empty air. I didn't hear anyone climb up the wall. There was no real ledge to stand on. We were 20 feet straight up in the air over solid concrete. Yet something incredibly tall or suspended was right outside my window in the pouring rain, quietly trying to force its way inside my room. I didn't grab any of my clothes. I didn't bother packing my duffel bag. I just blindly grabbed my car keys right off the nightstand, bolted as fast as I could for the door, and threw the heavy deadbolt open. I sprinted frantically down the exterior concrete stairs, nearly slipping backwards on the wet steps in just my socks. I didn't stop running until I physically reached my car. I fumbled wildly with the keys, got the heavy door open, and locked it the very second I was safely inside the cabin. I started the engine instantly and threw the car aggressively into reverse. As I peeled out of the flooded parking lot, the tires slipping on the wet pavement, I looked back up at room 214 one last time. Through the driving rain and the darkness, I could see the bathroom light shining out of the cracked door, and I could clearly see the window. The heavy wooden chair I had wedged against the glass was completely gone from view. The window was pushed wide open to the storm, and the heavy floral curtains were blowing wildly out into the dark night. I drove straight onto the highway and absolutely didn't stop driving until the sun finally came up and I was multiple states away. I never went back for my bag. I never even called the motel to complain or check out. I just wanted to put as much physical distance between me and whatever was floating outside that second floor window as physically possible. I still lock my windows every single night now, no matter what floor of a building I happen to be sleeping on. But whenever the heavy rain starts tapping against the glass, I can't help but wonder if it's really just the storm outside, or if that thing finally managed to track me down. If you were trapped in a room and saw muddy handprints forming on the outside of your second-story window, what is the very first thing you would do? Story 2. Back in my early 20s, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. My name is Chloe. Back then, I relied on the transit system to get into the city. My shift always ended at 1 a.m., meaning I usually caught the 1:45 train. One night in late November, my manager kept me late. By the time I swiped my transit card, the clock read 2:12 a.m. I missed my train. The next one wasn't supposed to arrive until 3:15 a.m. I descended the broken escalator heavily. The platform was completely deserted. That wasn't unusual, but it still made me feel exposed. The air smelled of damp concrete. I found a plastic bench right under a flickering fluorescent light. It buzzed slightly. I sat down and checked my phone, 10% battery. I decided to save it for the dark walk home, shoving it back into my pocket. I had absolutely nothing to do but wait. Without my phone, the underground station felt bigger and quieter. Usually there's some background noise, a janitor, a stray rat, or distant traffic. But that night the silence was incredibly thick. It felt heavy. I shifted uncomfortably. The buzzing from the overhead light seemed to get louder. I kept glancing down the dark tunnel to my left, hoping to see headlights, but there was only pitch black. Across the tracks, the opposite platform was dark. The lights had been shut off for maintenance. It was just a solid wall of blackness. I caught myself staring into it, trying to make shapes out of the deep shadows. I kept thinking I saw subtle shifts in movement. I rubbed my eyes hard. It was just sheer exhaustion from an 8-hour shift. I looked up at the digital departure board hanging from the ceiling. Earlier, it had shown my train arriving at 3:15 a.m., but as I watched, the bright orange letters began to flicker. They glitched, turning into a confusing scramble of random symbols. It lasted for 10 seconds before the entire screen went blank. I figured it was just a broken system. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Almost as soon as I did, I heard a faint sound. It came from the dark tunnel to my left. It wasn't the rushing wind of a normal train. It sounded like thick metal scraping heavily against metal, a slow, dragging sound echoing down the walls. I opened my eyes quickly and sat up straight. The sound stopped completely. I sat perfectly still, holding my breath. I waited for the noise to happen again. 2 full minutes passed in silence. I tried to convince myself it was just old metal pipes settling in the cold, but a deep unease had already settled into my stomach. I stood up and walked a few paces away from the bench. I looked back up at the digital departure board. It was back on, but it didn't say 3:15 a.m. anymore. The time was completely gone. Instead, the orange letters just spelled out one single word: arriving. I nervously pulled my phone out. The screen showed 2:34 a.m. It didn't make logical sense. The last train was nowhere near due, and no express trains ran at this hour. I looked back at the glowing board. It still just said arriving. There was no listed destination. A sudden freezing breeze swept through the station, smelling sharply of old rust. Usually that rush of air meant a large train was pushing through the tunnel, but I didn't hear the deafening roar of an engine. I just heard that terrible scraping sound again. This time it was louder and much closer. It sounded like someone dragging a heavy iron chain along the concrete floor. It was slow and rhythmic. I slowly backed away from the edge of the platform. The yellow warning line suddenly felt too close to the dangerous drop-off. I stood near the tiled wall, my heart beating faster. I really didn't want to get on a train that sounded like that. Then the front of the train emerged from the pitch blackness. It didn't have any headlights turned on. A massive train moving through a dark tunnel with absolutely no lights on. It glided forward smoothly, moving incredibly slow. It barely made any sound as it rolled along the metal tracks. The scraping noise had finally stopped. Now there was just a low mechanical hum. As it pulled fully into the dimly lit station, the flickering lights briefly illuminated the passing cars. It was incredibly old, not just outdated but genuinely ancient. The dark metal was severely rusted. It looked like an abandoned train car rotting in a rail yard. The windows were entirely caked in a thick layer of grime, making it impossible to see inside. The train squealed softly as it came to a complete halt right in front of me. I stood totally frozen against the tiled wall. The ancient engine hummed with a deep, heavy vibration that I could feel through my shoes. I waited quietly for the automated speaker voice to announce the stop. I waited for the doors to slide open, but absolutely nothing happened. The dark train just sat there in dead silence. The doors remained shut. I didn't take a single step toward it. Every natural instinct screamed at me to stay back. I just wanted it to roll away so I could be alone again. But it didn't move an inch. After a few agonizing moments, my own morbid curiosity forced me to step carefully over the yellow warning line, leaning forward to peer through the grime-covered window. The lighting inside the train was an incredibly dim, sickly yellow. At first glance, I thought the car was empty. But as my eyes adjusted to the shadows behind the dirty glass, I realized how wrong I was. Every single passenger seat was taken. There were men, women, and children sitting in the faded plastic seats, but none of them were moving. They were all sitting perfectly rigid, facing the windows. They were all facing me. My breath caught painfully in my throat. I couldn't make out their features clearly because of the dirt, but I could see their pale shapes in the dim light. Dozens of them in that train car, just staring blankly out at the platform, staring directly at me. Absolute terror washed over my body. I felt completely paralyzed by the sight of them. They looked exactly like lifeless mannequins, yet I knew they were watching me. The silence stretched on, then it was broken. Not by the train engine, but by a sharp sound that made my blood run cold. Tab, tab, tab. I flinched violently. The sound came from the window directly in front of my face. One of the pale figures on the other side had slowly raised their arm. A stark white hand was now pressed completely flat against the inside of the window. The index finger was slowly, deliberately tapping against the thick glass. Tab, tab, tab. It was a slow, agonizingly deliberate rhythm. The pale figure wasn't looking away or blinking. It just kept staring forward, tapping the dirty glass with a sickeningly hollow sound. I wanted to scream, but my voice was trapped inside my chest. I finally found the sheer strength to back up quickly until my shoulders hit the hard tiled wall. The tapping suddenly stopped. The hand slowly slid down the dirty glass, disappearing back into the dim yellow light. A second later, the deep hum of the train shifted loudly, sounding like a heavy exhale. The train began to inch forward. It moved away just as slowly as it had arrived. I stood completely glued to the tiled wall, watching the rusted metal cars slide slowly past my face. In every single window that passed, I saw the exact same horrifying thing. Pale, rigid figures sitting in the dim light, their heads turned to watch me as they rolled by. It took almost 2 full minutes for the train to disappear into the black tunnel. I didn't move for a long time after that. I just stood there, shaking in the cold. At 3:15 a.m. exactly, my real train finally arrived. It was loud, bright, and completely normal. I got on quickly and didn't close my eyes for a single second of the ride home. I still take the transit system occasionally, but I refuse to ever be the last person waiting on an underground platform. If I miss my train now, I just walk. If you were trapped alone in a dark station and a train like that pulled in, would you try to look through the dirty glass or just run out of the underground immediately? Let me know your honest thoughts down in the comments. Story 3. This happened during the summer I spent helping out on my uncle's isolated farm. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. My name is Tyler. When I was 19, I needed quick cash before the fall semester, so I took a job on my uncle's sprawling farm in the middle of nowhere. It was beautiful during the day, but at night it was swallowed by total darkness. He told me I could stay in the small, converted room above the main barn. It was completely separate from his house, which sat down a long dirt path. For that summer, that little loft was my house. I liked the idea of having my own space. It was a simple setup, just a bed, a small desk, and an electric heater. The only thing separating me from the elements was the thin wooden walls and the slanted tin roof directly above my head. The first few days were absolutely exhausting. We hauled hay and fixed fences until sunset. By the time I climbed the creaky stairs to my loft each evening, my legs were burning, and all I wanted was sleep. That first night I learned quickly how loud an old barn can be. Wood creaks and groans as the temperature drops. The wind whistles through gaps in the siding. Down below, the occasional shuffle from the animals would echo up through the floorboards. I was so drained, I just forced myself to tune it out. I had a rusted metal lantern on my desk that I used as a reading light. I turned it off around 10:30 p.m. and immediately drifted into a deep sleep. I do not know what time it was when I woke up. I just remember feeling an intense cold in the room. I lay quietly in the pitch dark, staring straight up, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it. A slow, incredibly heavy thud came from directly above me. I held my breath. The ceiling of my room was flat drywall, but above that was a tiny, cramped crawl space under the roof's peak. It was not a room. It was an empty void maybe 2 feet high, filled with old insulation and decades of dust. Nothing should have been up there. Then came another thud, and another. It was not a raccoon. The sound was too heavy, too deliberate. It sounded exactly like the measured packing of a large man wearing thick work boots. The footsteps moved slowly from the left side of the ceiling, crossing directly over my bed and stopped near the right wall. The old wood groaned under the immense weight. I stared up into the blackness, my heart hammering painfully. I tried to tell myself it was just the barn settling because old farm structures do weird things, but my stomach twisted. The distinct spacing between sounds and the heavy impact sounded exactly like a person. But how could a person even fit up there? After a few minutes of agonizing silence, the sounds abruptly stopped. I eventually convinced myself I was hearing things and fell back into an uneasy sleep. When morning came, the bright sunlight pouring through the dusty window made the whole experience seem ridiculous. I walked down to the main house for breakfast and casually mentioned the noises to my uncle. He laughed and told me it was probably just the old iron weather vane on the barn roof scraping in the wind. He said it had been loose for years. That explanation brought me immediate relief. The weather vane, that made perfect sense. I spent the day working in the fields, sweating under the sun, and let the fear wash away. By the time evening rolled around, I was feeling great. I showered and got ready for bed. I sat at my desk, reading by the warm glow of the lantern. I felt a little embarrassed about how scared I had been. I turned the lantern off around 11:15 p.m. The darkness in that isolated loft was absolute. For a while, it was just normal night sounds like the gentle wind and the faint rustling below. But right around 1:30 a.m., it started again. Thud, thud, thud. My eyes snapped open. The heavy, deliberate packing was back. But this time it was significantly louder. The invisible weight pressing down on the floorboards seemed immense. I could clearly hear the dry wood bending with every single step. The footsteps started near the door, packing slowly toward the center of my room. I lay frozen under the blankets. My mind raced frantically, trying to find a logical explanation. It has to be the weather vane. But there was absolutely no wind tonight. The night air was dead silent. As the impossibly heavy steps crossed directly over my desk, the old metal lantern began to rattle slightly. It was a faint, metallic vibration, but in the quiet room, it was deafening. The sheer weight of whatever was packing up there was shaking the furniture below. I wanted to yell out, I wanted to ask who was up there, but my throat felt tight. I was genuinely terrified that if I made a sound, the packing footsteps would stop and come down to find me. The walking continued for what felt like hours, back and forth. It was like whatever was up there was trapped, endlessly walking the short length of the narrow roof space. The rhythm was not frantic, it was slow, patient, and methodical. Eventually, the sound stopped right in the exact middle of the ceiling. I stayed awake until sunrise, my eyes locked on the drywall. When morning broke, I was too unnerved to let it go. I needed to see exactly what was up there. I dragged a ladder from the lower level and set it up beneath the access panel in my closet. My hands were shaking as I climbed the rungs. I pushed firmly on the wooden panel and it popped open. I grabbed my flashlight, took a deep breath, and poked my head up into the darkness. I swept the beam across the cramped, triangular space. It was exactly as I pictured. The air was incredibly stale. The floor was just exposed wooden joists with thick pink insulation, and covering everything was a thick, totally undisturbed layer of gray dust. There was no room for a person to stand up, let alone walk back and forth. I felt a massive wave of relief. It really was just the house settling. I went about my day feeling like a huge weight had been lifted off me. I stayed up late that night watching videos. I finally decided to sleep around 2:15 a.m. I turned off the lights and pulled the blankets up, feeling safe. But less than 20 minutes later, the illusion shattered. The noise did not start with a slow pace. It started with a massive, violent crash directly above my bed. Dust drifted down from the ceiling onto my face. Then the heavy, stomping footsteps began. They were frantic and angry. The old wood shrieked under the pressure. The lantern on my desk rattled so hard it actually fell off, hitting the floor with a loud clang. I could not just lay there anymore. Adrenaline completely overrode my fear. I grabbed my flashlight, trembling, and ran to the closet. I did not even think. I climbed the ladder, shoved the access panel out of the way, and pulled myself halfway up into the opening. I aimed the flashlight into the pitch-black void. The air was thick with fresh dust, swirling in the beam of light. I pointed the light toward the area directly over my bed. My breath caught sharply in my throat. The thick layer of dust on the wooden joists was completely disturbed. There, pressed deep into the gray powder, were massive, heavy boot prints. They were perfectly clear, sinking deep into the insulation. The prints walked back and forth in a tight line exactly where I had heard the packing, but there was absolutely no one there. The cramped space was empty. I stared at the prints, my mind unable to process what I was seeing. A cold, suffocating dread settled over my entire body. I was completely paralyzed, hovering halfway out of the access hole. Then the air around me seemed to drop 20 degrees. The silence in the barn became overwhelmingly heavy. I slowly lowered the flashlight beam, preparing to climb back down. That is when I heard a distinct, soft crunching sound in the insulation. It was coming from right in front of me. I quickly raised the light back up. About 10 feet away, a new, massive boot print suddenly pressed down into the thick dust, then another, and another. The deep, heavy impressions were appearing right in front of my eyes, stepping slowly and deliberately toward the access hole where I was hanging. There was nothing making them. I dropped down from the ladder so fast I twisted my ankle on the hard floorboards, but I did not even care. I grabbed my car keys, ran blindly down the barn stairs, and drove off that property in the middle of the night without looking back. What would be your immediate reaction if you saw invisible footsteps walking toward you in the dead of night? Story 4. This happened on a cold, late-night cinema night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. My name is Rachel. I was 22 at the time, and I had a habit of going to see movies by myself. It was my favorite way to decompress after an exhausting week of classes. I always preferred the late-night showings. The crowds were gone, the lobby was hollow, and you could just sink into a seat in the dark. I had driven out to the older multiplex on the edge of town. It was around 11:30 p.m. when I pulled into the empty parking lot. I parked near the back, right next to a line of dead trees. I remember sitting in the driver's seat, finishing my coffee. The wind was blowing hard. That was when I heard a distinct, rhythmic tapping sound on my passenger window. I glanced over quickly. I assumed it was just a loose branch from the bushes scraping against the glass. I brushed it off, grabbed my purse, and hurried out into the freezing air. The theater felt strange from the moment I walked in. It was deserted, which wasn't unusual, but the air felt stale. The teenager working the ticket counter looked exhausted. He was staring blankly at his phone, barely acknowledging me as he tore my ticket stub. The concession stand was closed down, the popcorn machines wiped clean. I walked past the darkened arcade games, making my way down the carpeted hallway toward theater number 7. The muffled sounds of action movies from other screens echoed softly off the walls. I pushed open the heavy doors and walked into the auditorium. As expected, it was completely empty. There were just rows of faded red velvet seats sitting silently in the dim light of the sconces. I walked down the slanted aisle, chose a spot in the middle, and got comfortable. The screen lit up and the trailers began playing. For a while, everything felt perfectly normal. I was just a girl enjoying a quiet movie night, but about an hour into the film, things got weird. The projector suddenly glitched. The massive screen flickered violently, bathed the room in a strobe of white light, and then went entirely black. When the picture came back on, it resumed playing, but the audio was completely gone. It was jarring. I was sitting there watching moving images in absolute dead silence. I waited a few minutes in my seat, expecting an employee to fix the sound. Nothing happened. Nobody came in. The silence inside the cavernous room started to feel incredibly heavy. The only sound I could hear was the faint thumping of my own pulse. The silence felt unnatural. After 10 minutes of enduring the silent film, I decided to step out and let a staff member know. I grabbed my purse, walked back up the slanted aisle, and pushed firmly against the exit doors leading to the main hallway. They didn't budge. I frowned, readjusted my grip, and pushed harder, throwing my shoulder into the wood. Still nothing. The doors were locked from the outside. A cold wave of confusion washed over me. I tried pulling them, even though they were clearly push doors. They were secured tight. I felt a sharp spike of anxiety bloom in my chest. Why would they lock the doors while someone was inside? I pulled out my phone with trembling hands to check the time. It was 1:45 a.m. Maybe the tired staff had just locked up the building and forgotten I was here. I turned on my phone's flashlight, the white beam cutting through the darkness. The silent movie was still playing on the giant screen down below. I remembered there was an emergency exit door located down at the front of the auditorium. I hurried back down the stairs, my sneakers squeaking loudly in the heavy silence. When I reached the heavy metal door, I slammed both hands against the crash bar. It didn't move. It was completely jammed shut, as if someone had welded it from the outside. Panic finally started to set in. I was genuinely trapped inside this dark room. Just as I raised my fists to start banging loudly against the metal frame, the main power to the entire building suddenly cut out. The giant screen went pitch black. The quiet hum of the building died instantly. A second later, the emergency backup lights flickered on with an aggressive buzz. They cast the entire theater in a sickly pale yellow glow. The auditorium looked entirely different and much more menacing under those dim lights. The rows of empty red seats looked unnatural. The shadows cast by the chairs stretched out abnormally long across the aisles. I stood near the bottom of the screen, trying to force myself to stay calm. I reasoned that there had to be another way out. I decided to walk slowly back up the stairs to try the main double doors one more time. As I started walking up the incline, I noticed my own shadow stretching out tall on the wall beside me, cast by the harsh angle of the yellow emergency lights. It moved smoothly as I moved, bouncing slightly with every step I took. But after passing a few rows, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My shadow wasn't matching my movements perfectly anymore. I abruptly stopped walking. My shadow took another full step on the wall before freezing in place. I blinked hard, desperately trying to convince myself that the dim lighting was just playing tricks on my tired brain. I took one slow, deliberate step forward. The dark shadow on the wall remained completely still for a full second. Then it jerked forward unnaturally, catching up to my position. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. I stood perfectly still, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I raised my right arm very slowly into the air. The dark silhouette cast on the wall beside me did absolutely nothing, just stood there with its arms down. Then agonizingly slowly, the shadow raised its arm too. It was mimicking me, but there was a distinct, terrifying delay in its reaction. I felt completely frozen to the spot, staring at the yellow wall in absolute horror. This was physically impossible. Shadows do not lag behind the people casting them. I started walking much faster, practically jogging up the remaining stairs toward the back of the auditorium. I kept my eyes fixed firmly on the wall beside me as I moved. The dark shape was visibly struggling to keep up with my pace now. It was lagging further and further behind me with every step, its movements becoming strangely jerky and fragmented. Its edges were becoming far too sharp, far too defined, like it was gathering actual mass. I reached the top of the stairs by the locked main doors. I turned around to look back down the aisle. The shadow wasn't on the wall anymore. The yellow plaster was completely blank. I scanned the dim theater, my heart hammering against my ribs. Then I saw it. Halfway down the center aisle, sitting perfectly still in one of the middle seats, was a pitch-black figure. It had no features, just a dense mass of solid darkness. It wasn't flat anymore. It was three-dimensional, sitting exactly where I had been watching the movie. The terrifying thing slowly turned its head, looking directly up at me. I could feel its gaze burning into my skin. I threw myself backward against the double doors, screaming for help. Suddenly, the heavy wood gave way with a loud crack, flying open so fast I stumbled into the hallway. I scrambled to my feet and sprinted blindly down the dark corridor. I ran straight through the lobby to the glass exit doors, pushing them open into the freezing night air. I sprinted across the empty parking lot, threw myself into my car, and locked the doors. As I sped away, my headlights swept across the glass front of the cinema. Standing inside the lobby, pressed against the glass, was that same pitch-black figure. Right beside it, tapping a single dark finger against the glass, was a second shadow. It was the exact same tapping rhythm I had heard before going inside. I never went back. Story 5. During my time at an old coastal lighthouse, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. I had taken a short-term gig as a caretaker for an old, decommissioned lighthouse. The setup was pretty simple. The main tower stood tall on a rocky cliff, and connected to it was a small stone building where the keepers used to live. It was technically a basement apartment, complete with thick stone walls, small high windows, and a heavy wooden door that led up to the main ground floor. It was a beautiful spot during the day, but at night the isolation felt heavy. I remember the first night being incredibly loud. The ocean waves constantly crashed against the rocks below, and the wind howled around the tower like a living thing. I had brought a few books and an old portable radio to keep myself entertained. During the day, the property felt like a rugged, peaceful retreat. I spent hours walking along the jagged coastline, watching the gray waves crash against the sea wall. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the atmosphere changed completely. The lighthouse stopped feeling like a sanctuary and started feeling like a prison. But it was the building itself that made the most noise. When I heard dull thuds from above, I did not think much of it. I figured it was just the heavy coastal winds vibrating the metal fixtures, or maybe birds nesting near the lantern room at the top. I spent the first 2 days settling into a routine. By the third night, the weather shifted. A thick coastal fog rolled in, blanketing everything in a heavy gray mist. The wind died completely down. And that is when the silence started. The roaring ocean faded into a muffled, lazy roll. I was sitting at the small kitchen table, sipping a cup of black coffee. The microwave clock read 3 a.m. The sudden lack of noise kept me wide awake. I was just staring at the wall, then I heard it. It was not a creak and it was not the wind. It was a clear, heavy knock. It came from the thick, iron-reinforced metal door on the ground floor, the one that led directly out to the cliffside walk. To make a sound that loud, someone would have to be hitting it with a rock or pounding on it with both fists. I froze, my coffee cup stopped halfway to my mouth. I just sat there, holding my breath, waiting to see if I had imagined it. A few seconds passed, then another knock, 3 solid, rhythmic strikes against the metal. Boom, boom, boom. My heart slammed against my ribs. I set the mug down so carefully, terrified that even the clinking of ceramic would give away my position. Who would be out there? It was the middle of the night, miles away from anyone, wrapped in a freezing fog. But why would they come to the ocean-facing maintenance door? The basement felt suddenly freezing. I walked over to the wooden stairs that led up to the ground level. The steps squeaked under my weight as I slowly climbed up into the base of the tower. The ground floor was a circular stone room with a massive iron spiral staircase winding up into the dark. On the far wall was the metal door. I just stared at it. But there was nothing, just that heavy, ringing silence. I called out, but there was no answer. I slowly walked over to the door. It had a small, thick glass porthole at eye level. The fog outside was dense, glowing faintly in the moonlight. I could see the rocky path leading to the edge of the cliff, but there was no one there. I carefully unlocked the heavy deadbolt with a loud clack, turned the iron latch, and pulled the door open. The freezing night air hit my face instantly. The heavy iron hinges groaned as the door swung outward, the sound completely breaking the eerie stillness of the night. I stepped out onto the damp concrete platform, the beam of my small flashlight cutting through the thick, swirling mist. There was absolutely nobody, no footprints in the damp soil nearby, no tail lights in the distance, nothing. But what really unsettled me was the ocean. I looked down over the edge of the guardrail. The water was completely flat, it was dead still. I had never seen the ocean look like that, especially out here. It looked like a sheet of black glass, unnaturally calm. A deep wave of dread washed over me. I felt incredibly exposed standing out there. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to get back inside. I quickly stepped back into the lighthouse, pulled the heavy iron door shut, and threw the deadbolt back into place. I even pulled the secondary sliding lock, making sure it was completely secure before I backed away. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely get the latch to catch. Once it was locked, I stood perfectly still, pressing my ear against the freezing cold metal, half expecting to hear breathing on the other side, but there was nothing. I told myself it must have been a trick of the acoustics. Maybe a piece of loose debris had struck the side of the tower, and the hollow structure made it sound like a knock. I walked back toward the wooden stairs leading to the basement. I was exhausted, just wanting to wait for daylight. I had one foot on the first wooden step when the knocking started again. But this time I physically stumbled backward. The sound did not come from the heavy metal door outside. It came from directly above me. Boom, boom, boom. It was loud, clear, and unmistakable. Someone was knocking on the inside wall of the lighthouse, one floor up. I stared up into the dark hollow of the tower. The iron spiral staircase coiled upward, disappearing into the pitch black above the second landing. The only light was the dim yellow bulb casting long, strange shadows against the curving brick walls. I had checked the property when I arrived. The doors were locked tight, yet the sound was right there. I could not move. I just stood at the bottom of the stairs, gripping the wooden handrail so hard my knuckles ached. I tried to convince myself it was just the building settling or old pipes, but the wind was dead outside. Something else was in the tower. Then it happened again. Boom, boom, boom. But it was higher this time. It sounded like it was coming from the third floor. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. I realized something that made my blood run absolutely cold. The sound was moving up the inside curve of the tower wall, but there were no stairs on that side. The spiral staircase hugged the opposite wall. Whatever was making that noise was knocking on a section of the wall that hung directly over a 50-foot drop. There was nothing for anyone to stand on. It was like something was climbing the smooth interior brick, tapping as it went. It didn't make any logical sense. A bird wouldn't make a heavy, thudding sound like that. A loose pipe wouldn't knock in such a deliberate, slow rhythm. I backed away from the stairwell, my heart hammering in my throat. I retreated slowly toward the kitchen area in the basement, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark opening above. A minute passed, then another knock, fainter this time, coming from even higher up, near the fourth-floor landing. It was methodical, patient, just moving steadily upward toward the lantern room at the very top of the lighthouse. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed me. I wanted to run, but my car keys were in my bedroom, and the front door was on the opposite side of the dark spiral staircase. I would have to walk right underneath whatever was up there to leave. I stood frozen in the dim kitchen, listening. For what felt like hours, I tracked the sound. Every few minutes, a hollow tap echoed down from the dark. It grew fainter and fainter as it ascended the massive tower. Eventually, the sound reached the very top. I heard a faint, dull thud echoing from the glass-enclosed lantern room directly above, and then the knocking stopped. The absolute silence returned, heavier and more terrifying than before. I did not go to sleep. I backed into the corner of the basement bedroom and sat on the floor with my knees pulled to my chest. I kept my eyes locked on the wooden stairs, waiting for the sound of something coming back down. But nothing came. When the first dim light of dawn finally crept through the small windows, I grabbed my keys and sprinted across the ground floor, refusing to even look up into the dark spiral of the tower. I shoved the front door open, ran to my car, and drove away as fast as I safely could. I never went back. I know the deliberate, heavy rhythm of those knocks, and I know nothing was physically there to make them. If you heard impossible footsteps climbing the inside walls of an empty room, let me know in the comments what your very first move would be. Story 6. Around my time working the night shift at a call center, I started getting strange notifications from my security camera. The weird part was, the camera wasn't even plugged in. I was 22, living alone. To pay rent, I worked the graveyard shift handling after-hours calls for random businesses. Plumbers, towing companies, dental offices, mindless work. The call center was a cavernous warehouse on the edge of a dead industrial park. During the day, 200 people talked over each other. But at night, it was just me, a supervisor locked in his office, and maybe 3 other reps scattered across an endless sea of gray cubicles. I had been sitting there for 3 hours when my cell phone buzzed. I saw a notification from the cheap security camera in my apartment. It said motion was detected in my living room. I stared at the screen, feeling a heavy drop in my stomach. I had physically unplugged that camera 2 days ago. It had been acting up, so I literally pulled the power cord out of the wall. There was no way it should be sending alerts. I opened the app to check the live feed. My screen sat on a black loading screen, spinning endlessly. It could not connect, obviously, because the device had no power. I told myself it was a weird glitch and put my phone down, but you know that feeling when something doesn't sit right? The massive building felt entirely too quiet after that. The only sound was the constant hum of the air conditioning vents far above. The overhead fluorescent lights were dimmed by half, leaving the far corners drowned in heavy shadows. I looked over my cubicle divider. 4 rows down, I could see the top of my coworker's head. His name was David. He was wearing his bulky headset, staring straight ahead at his monitors. The pale blue light reflected off his glasses. He looked normal, just quietly clicking his mouse. I thought about walking over to ask him about delayed notifications, just to hear a human voice, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. I sank back into my chair and waited. It was exactly 2:30 in the morning when my screen lit up with an incoming call. Usually the caller ID software gave us a heads up on who we were answering for, but this time the information box was completely blank. No phone number, no company name, just a flashing green button indicating a live line. I hesitated. It felt genuinely strange, but our metrics were heavily monitored and letting a call ring too long would get me written up. Taking a deep breath, I clicked my mouse to accept the call. "Thank you for calling. How can I help you today?" I said, using my polite customer service voice. There was no answer. I didn't even hear the usual faint background static you get on a phone call. The line was unnervingly silent. I waited a few seconds and repeated myself a little louder. "Hello, is anyone there?" I assumed it was a dropped call or a pocket dial. I was moving my cursor to click the disconnect button when I heard it. It was incredibly faint at first. I had to press the foam earpiece tighter against my ear to make sure I wasn't imagining things. It sounded exactly like whispering. But it wasn't just one person whispering. It sounded like a massive room full of people, like standing in a crowded auditorium right before a show, but everyone is speaking in frantic, hushed tones. It was an overlapping, constant stream of low whispering. My heart started beating faster. "Hello," I said once more, my voice trembling. The whispering did not stop, and it did not respond. It just kept pouring directly into my ear. I strained to listen, but couldn't make out a recognizable word. It didn't sound like English. It was just harsh consonants and breathless syllables bleeding into each other. I felt an intense urge to get off the line. Listening to it made my stomach turn. I quickly clicked the red end call button. The digital button depressed, but the call duration timer just kept ticking up. 1 minute and 12 seconds, 1 minute and 13. The call simply refused to drop. I clicked again, mashing my mouse harder. Nothing happened. The whispering was getting louder now. It sounded incredibly urgent. Like the overlapping voices were desperately trying to warn me about something terrible. Panicking, I pulled the physical headset jack completely out of the audio port on my console. That should have killed the audio immediately. It is a hard physical disconnect. But when I held the plastic headset in my trembling hands, I could still hear the furious whispering coming directly from the tiny speaker. It was distorted now, bleeding out into the quiet air of my cubicle. I sat completely frozen, staring at this piece of cheap plastic on my desk. My panicked mind desperately tried to find a logical explanation. Maybe the routing software had crashed and caused an audio loop. I looked nervously at my screen. The call timer was still ticking upward. The screen was totally frozen. I needed to show someone right away. I stood up quickly, my chair bumping loudly into the desk behind me. The noise echoed sharply across the empty floor. I looked over toward David's desk in the distance. He hadn't moved an inch. He was sitting in the exact same rigid position, staring straight ahead at his monitors. I walked out of my aisle and headed briskly toward his section. The carpeted floor muffled my footsteps. "Hey, David," I called out, keeping my voice low so I wouldn't disturb the other reps. He did not answer me. As I walked down the dim aisle, the air in the room felt incredibly cold. I rubbed my bare arms, feeling harsh goosebumps break out. When I reached the entrance to his cubicle, I stopped dead in my tracks. David was sitting perfectly upright, but his dual monitors were pitch black. They were completely powered off. He was staring blankly into a dead, dark screen. His headset was firmly over his ears, and the microphone boom was positioned close to his mouth. "David," I said again, stepping slightly closer. That is exactly when I realized he was speaking. His voice was so quiet I almost missed it, but his pale lips were moving in a fast, continuous blur. I leaned in slightly, trying hard to hear what he was saying to the empty screen. He wasn't taking a customer call. He wasn't reading a script. David was whispering, the specific cadence, the rapid rhythm, the strange, breathy syllables. He was repeating the exact same hushed, overlapping language I had just heard coming through my own disconnected headset. He was doing it perfectly, without ever pausing to take a breath, his eyes unblinking in the dim shadows. A heavy wave of pure terror hit me so hard my knees felt weak. I had absolutely no idea what to do. I just stood there paralyzed, watching my coworker endlessly repeat those unintelligible whispers into a dead headset. After a few agonizing seconds, I reached out a shaking hand and grabbed his shoulder. I shook him, probably harder than I meant to. David gasped loudly, his whole body jumping violently in the chair. He blinked rapidly, looking around the room in total confusion. He looked up at me, pale and sweating. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice totally normal again. He pulled his headset off, rubbing his eyes. "Man, I think I just dozed off with my eyes open." Didn't tell him what he was doing. I honestly couldn't even form the words. I just told him I felt sick and needed to go home. I ran back to my desk to grab my keys. My headset was still sitting where I left it. The tiny speaker was completely silent now. The impossible call was gone. I grabbed my bag and left. I quit the job the next afternoon via email. I never drove back to that industrial park, and I never plugged that apartment security camera back into the wall. I still do not know what truly happened that night. Over the years, I've tried to convince myself it was extreme fatigue or an electrical feedback loop in the call center's aging wiring. But sometimes, when it is completely silent in my house and the air conditioning kicks on, I have to turn on a fan. Because if I sit alone in the quiet for too long, I feel like the silence is just a fragile cover. And if I listen closely enough, I might hear that same breathless language waiting just beneath the surface. What do you think was coming through those headsets? A glitch or something else entirely? Story 7. This happened while I was house-sitting for my aunt at a deserted highway rest stop. The creaking floors didn't bother me until they started following me. My aunt manages an old rest facility off a rural highway in the Pacific Northwest. It is a wooden building from the 1970s, surrounded by thick pine trees. She lives in a small cabin located right behind the main property. She had a family emergency, so I agreed to stay and watch the place for a week. The gas pumps were automated. I just had to lock up the store at 11 p.m., check the restrooms, and leave the safety lights on. The first 2 days were peaceful. A trickle of cars would pull in during daylight, but by 10 p.m. the highway became practically abandoned. The silence was isolating. It was mid-November, bringing freezing nights and a thick fog that crept in from the tree line. Standing in the empty parking lot at midnight, you just saw gray mist under the yellow street lamps. The rest stop consisted of the store and an exterior hallway leading around back to the restrooms. The floors of that hallway were thick, weather-beaten wooden planks. Every step produced a groaning creak that echoed off the brick walls. I expected the old building to make noise. I just never expected the noise to start acting on its own. It was my third night. At 2:15 a.m., I realized I left my phone charger inside the main office. I was exhausted, but I needed it for an alarm. I threw on my coat and stepped into the freezing night. The fog was incredibly dense. The parking lot lights flickered, casting shadows across the empty asphalt. The highway was entirely silent. I unlocked the store's glass door, grabbed my charger from the back room, and turned to leave. Just as my hand touched the front door handle, I froze. I heard a sound coming from the exterior hallway. It was a distinct creak, the unmistakable sound of a heavy footstep pressing down on those warped floorboards. I stood perfectly still. Then I heard it again. I assumed a traveler had pulled up to use the bathroom, but I hadn't heard an engine. Looking through the windows, the parking lot was entirely empty. A feeling of deep unease settled into my stomach. I walked toward the dark hallway. The exterior lights were burned out, leaving the corridor in heavy shadow. I took a step onto the wooden deck. My boot made a loud creak. I took another step, another loud creak. I started walking down the hallway toward the men's room. That is when the horrible realization hit me. I took a step and the wood creaked under my weight. A fraction of a second later, another distinct creak echoed right behind me. I stopped abruptly. The phantom creaking stopped immediately. My heart began to pound. I took 2 quick steps forward. Creak, creak. Almost instantly, from the darkness just a few feet behind my back, I heard the exact same rhythm. Creak, creak. It sounded like someone mimicking my movements, packing perfectly to blend in with my footsteps. Pure panic clouded my thinking. I was terrified of what might be in the shadows. I rushed forward, pushed open the heavy wooden door to the men's restroom, and quickly locked the deadbolt. I stood with my back pressed against the door, breathing heavily, listening to the silence outside. Nobody knocked. The restroom was lit by harsh fluorescent tubes. The floor was dirty ceramic tile, meaning the wooden creaking could not follow me inside. The room smelled of cheap chemical cleaner. I was completely alone. Empty stalls lined the left wall. On the right side was a row of metal sinks beneath a massive wall mirror stretching across the room. I desperately convinced myself the echoing footsteps were just a strange acoustic trick. I walked to the center sink and turned on the faucet. The pipes groaned loudly before a stream of freezing water sputtered out. I splashed the icy water onto my face, trying to calm my nerves. I reached for a paper towel and dried my face. I looked up at myself in the wall mirror. I looked exhausted, with dark circles under my eyes and damp hair. I tossed the crumpled paper towel into the trash can next to the sink. But as I stared closely at my reflection, a deeply unsettling feeling washed over me. Something felt fundamentally wrong. It was a subtle, dizzying sensation, almost like a sudden drop in air pressure. I kept my eyes fixed on the mirror. I blinked. My reflection blinked as well, but it felt strangely wrong. I couldn't immediately process why. I stared intensely into my own tired eyes in the glass. I blinked a second time. This time I paid very close attention to the timing. I closed my eyes, and a fraction of a second later, the reflection closed its eyes. It was lagging. It was exactly like watching a live video feed with a bad internet connection. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead and neck. My brain rejected what I was seeing. I desperately told myself it was extreme sleep deprivation. Severe fatigue can cause visual hallucinations. I needed to prove my mind was just playing tricks on me. Slowly, hesitantly, I raised my right hand to scratch the side of my neck. In the mirror, my reflection raised its right hand and scratched its neck perfectly. It seemed completely normal that time. The bizarre delay appeared to be gone. I let out a shaky breath of relief, feeling foolish again. Just to be certain, I forced a small smile and gave a short, casual wave to my reflection. That is the exact moment my blood turned entirely to ice. I waved my hand, but the reflection did not wave back. Instead, the figure in the mirror simply stood there. It hesitated. It remained perfectly still for 2 full seconds, its arms resting normally at its sides. I couldn't move or breathe. I was completely paralyzed by absolute terror. Very slowly and incredibly stiffly, the reflection raised its right hand. It gave a slow, rigid mechanical wave. It looked like an entity that had never waved before in its life, trying to copy the physical motion from memory. The reflection then dropped its hand to its side and stopped mirroring my actions entirely. It just stood there on the other side of the glass, staring straight ahead directly into my terrified eyes. Its face had gone completely blank. The pale expression was entirely devoid of any human emotion whatsoever. Then the corners of its mouth twitched sharply upward into a subtle, unnatural grimace. Slowly, deliberately, the thing leaned its upper body forward. It raised both of its hands and placed its palms flat against the inside surface of the mirror. In the dead silence of the brightly lit bathroom, I heard a terrible sound. It was a faint, high-pitched scratching noise. It was the horrible sound of hard fingernails scraping against glass, and it was coming directly from inside the mirror itself. That broke my paralysis completely. I spun around, fumbled with the deadbolt, and sprinted blindly into the freezing night. I didn't look back. I ran rapidly down the dark hallway, tore through the thick fog across the empty parking lot, and didn't stop until I reached the cabin. I slammed the front door shut, locked the deadbolt, and dragged an armchair directly in front of the entryway. I turned on every light inside the small house. I sat perfectly still on the sofa, clutching my keys in my shaking hands. I just stared blankly at the door until morning broke. I packed my bags the second the sky turned light outside. I could not stay another night. When my aunt called later, I told a terrible lie about a plumbing emergency at my apartment that required me to leave immediately. I never told her what I saw standing behind the glass. But there is one chilling realization that keeps me awake almost every single night since I left that dark highway rest stop. The most terrifying part wasn't just the unnatural reflection staring at me. It was those warped floorboards outside the bathroom. It was the echoing footsteps I heard on the wooden deck right before I went inside. Because now I know without a doubt that it was never an acoustic echo at all. The thing hiding outside in the dark was just practicing my physical movements, learning how to walk exactly like me, right before it slipped completely inside the mirror. If you ever saw your own reflection hesitate before copying your movements, what is the first thing you would logically do to survive? Story 8. I used to take late-night walks during my closing shifts at the downtown library. One night, I realized someone else had been walking the exact same route as me for weeks. My name is Natalie. A couple of years ago, I took a job as a night shift supervisor at a massive county library in the Pacific Northwest. My main responsibility was simply managing the building after 8 p.m. That mostly meant telling lingering patrons to pack up and locking the main front doors at midnight. Once those heavy glass doors were locked, my final task was to do a complete sweep of the entire building to ensure absolutely no one was hiding in the bathrooms or lost in the stacks. That nightly sweep was essentially a long, solitary walk through complete and utter emptiness. I actually used to look forward to it. After hours of dealing with noise, the absolute silence of a massive, empty library was surprisingly peaceful. At least, it started out that way. The building itself was incredibly old. It was built sometime in the early 1920s, with several modern additions tacked onto it over the decades. Because of that weird architectural history, the layout was incredibly confusing. There were dark, dead-end hallways and an expansive, labyrinth-like basement level that housed the overflow archives. The basement was easily my least favorite part of the nightly sweep. It was a sprawling maze of towering metal shelves packed with dusty, outdated reference books. The lighting down there was operated by incredibly cheap and unreliable motion sensors. Half the time, I had to wave my arms frantically in the dark just to get the fluorescent bulbs to click on, and they would always shut off way too quickly behind me. To cope with the creepy, isolated atmosphere, I developed a very specific, rigid routine. I would walk the exact same path down there every single night. I would head down the concrete staircase, walk past the east wall archives, do a quick loop around the reference aisles, and walk straight back out through the service elevator. It was a simple routine, but it made the massive, dark basement feel manageable. It was late October, around 11:45 p.m., when things started to feel slightly off. I had just locked the front entrance and was beginning my final rounds. The two main floors were completely clear. I made my way to the basement stairs, feeling that familiar wave of stale, cold air hit my face as I descended. I usually wore wireless earbuds during the sweep to listen to podcasts, but I had forgot to charge them that day. Without my music, the library felt aggressively quiet. You really do not realize how much unsettling noise an empty building makes until you are forced to listen to it in the dead of night. The thick pipes groaned in the walls, the old ventilation system hummed with a low drone, and my shoes squeaked loudly against the polished linoleum floor. I reached the bottom of the stairs and stepped into the pitch-black basement. The first bank of fluorescent lights flickered on with a loud buzzing noise. I started my usual route, walking briskly past the east wall. But as I passed the third row of towering metal shelves, I stopped dead in my tracks. Something was out of place. Along the far back wall of the basement, tucked away behind a row of heavy filing cabinets, was a door. It was solid wood, painted the exact same dull beige color as the concrete walls around it. I had walked past this exact spot dozens of times over the past few months, and I had never once noticed it. What made my stomach drop was the fact that the door was cracked open. It was just a few inches, enough to reveal a thin slice of absolute pitch-black darkness on the other side. My immediate rational thought was that an employee from the day shift had accidentally left it open. But the basement was strictly off-limits to the public, and the maintenance staff always left the building by 9 p.m. at the latest. I was supposed to be the only living person in the building. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the black gap. A freezing cold draft was slowly drifting out from the opening, carrying a strange scent. It didn't smell like old books or dust. It smelled strongly of damp earth and rust. I slowly approached the door. My heart was starting to beat a little faster, but I tried to convince myself I was just being paranoid. I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly in the cool air, and pushed the heavy door open wider. The metal hinges didn't make a single sound, which somehow made the situation feel even worse. I pulled my phone out of my pocket and turned on the flashlight. The bright beam cut through the thick darkness, revealing a narrow, incredibly long hallway. The walls weren't drywall or painted concrete like the rest of the modern basement. They were made of exposed, crumbling dark brick. The ceiling was noticeably lower, hanging just a few inches above my head. This didn't match the layout of the library building at all. I should have pulled the door shut, locked it, and called the library director in the morning. But a strange curiosity took over my better judgment. I felt an irrational need to know what this was, and I needed to be absolutely sure nobody was hiding down there in the dark. I took a deep breath and stepped through the doorway. The exact moment my foot crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted completely. The air in the narrow hallway was freezing, causing the hair on the back of my neck to stand straight up. I took a few more slow, hesitant steps forward, shining my phone light down the brick corridor. It seemed to stretch on forever into the absolute darkness. As I walked deeper into the narrow passage, I noticed something profoundly unsettling. The ambient noises of the library were completely gone. The humming vents, the buzzing fluorescent lights behind me, the distant rumble of the highway outside, everything simply vanished. The deeper I went, the quieter the environment became. It wasn't just quiet, it was a heavy, suffocating silence. It felt as though thick cotton was being pressed directly against my ears. I kept walking, my phone flashlight trembling slightly in my sweaty hand. I tried to focus on the sound of my own footsteps just to ground myself in reality, but then I realized something genuinely terrifying. I couldn't hear my shoes hitting the floor. I stopped walking, I looked down at my feet. I intentionally tapped my hard heel against the ground, nothing. The sound was just gone, completely swallowed by the unnatural acoustics of the hallway. Panic began to bubble up in my chest. This wasn't right, this wasn't physically possible. I opened my mouth to take a deep, calming breath, trying to slow my racing heart, but I couldn't hear the air entering my lungs. I couldn't hear my own breathing. The silence was so absolute that it felt like an immense physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I stood completely frozen in the dark, enveloped by a void of sound. My brain could not process the extreme sensory deprivation. I decided right then that I was done. I turned around to head back toward the entrance, but before I could take a single step forward, the impossible silence was suddenly broken. It wasn't a loud noise. It was incredibly soft, but in that total vacuum of sound, it sounded absolutely deafening. It was the distinct sound of a long, rattling exhale. Someone was breathing, but it wasn't me. The sound didn't come from down the dark hallway in front of me. It came from directly behind my right shoulder. It was so close I could almost feel the physical vibration of it in the freezing air. It was a wet, heavy, ragged breath, sounding exactly like someone struggling to push air through a damaged throat. My blood ran completely ice cold. My entire body locked up in sheer terror. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't blink. I just stood there paralyzed in the dark, my back turned to whatever was standing right behind me. Another breath immediately followed, a slow inhale, then a wet, rattling exhale. It was perfectly paced, calm, and unnervingly steady. Every single instinct screaming in my head told me to run, but my legs refused to move. I slowly, agonizingly shifted my arm to shine the phone flashlight over my shoulder. The beam swept across the crumbling brick wall, illuminating the empty space directly behind my back. There was absolutely nothing there. I swung the light wildly around the narrow hallway, desperately searching for any sign of a person hiding in the shadows. The corridor was completely empty, but the wet breathing didn't stop. In fact, it grew even louder. It sounded exactly as if an invisible, towering person was standing mere inches from my face. The horrible sound was moving, slowly shifting from my right side to my left side, slowly circling me in the pitch-black void. The paralyzing fear suddenly snapped, instantly replaced by pure adrenaline. I didn't try to look back again, I just sprinted. I ran back down the narrow hallway as fast as my legs could possibly carry me, no longer caring that my frantic footsteps made absolutely no sound. I just kept my wide eyes locked on the faint rectangular outline of the doorway far ahead. The ragged, heavy breathing seemed to follow right behind my neck, keeping perfect pace with my desperate sprint. I burst through the wooden doorway and stumbled violently into the main library basement. The sudden blast of humming vents and buzzing lights hit me like a physical wave. I spun around and slammed the heavy wooden door shut behind me with all my strength. My hands were shaking violently as I gripped the cold brass handle. There was no lock on the outside of the door. I just leaned my entire body weight against the heavy wood, gasping for air, tears of absolute panic stinging my eyes. I stood there pressed against the wood for what felt like hours, listening closely to the other side, but there was nothing, just the normal, everyday sounds of the old library. I backed away from the door very slowly, never taking my eyes off the painted wood. I practically ran to the service elevator, rode it up to the ground floor, and left the building immediately. I didn't even bother to finish locking the interior doors. I just ran to my car, got inside, and locked the doors. I sat in the dark parking lot for 20 minutes until my hands finally stopped shaking enough to drive home. I called the library director at 6 a.m. the very next morning and quit over the phone. I lied and told him I had a sudden family emergency and couldn't return to the job. I didn't mention the strange door or the hallway. I knew exactly how crazy the truth would sound to him. A few weeks later, a former coworker from the day shift texted me just to check in. We got to chatting about the job, and I casually asked her if she ever had to go down into the basement archives. She said she absolutely hated it down there. She complained about how incredibly dusty it always was, especially in the back corners. Then she casually mentioned something that made my stomach completely drop out. She asked why I used to walk the exact same, bizarre path down there every single night. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked her how she knew about my specific route. She said the basement floors get incredibly dusty because the maintenance crew only mops them once a month. She said my footprints were clearly visible in the thick gray dust, looping around the reference aisles and heading straight to the service elevator, over and over again. But that wasn't the specific detail that still haunts me to this day. She told me she always thought it was weird that there were two distinct sets of footprints following that exact same path. One set clearly belonged to my rubber-soled work shoes. The other set were large, bare feet, stepping perfectly in time with mine, right directly behind where I walked. For months, I thought the empty basement was my quiet sanctuary. But whatever invisible thing was breathing in that dark hallway hadn't just appeared that one terrifying night. It had been walking right behind me, in the dark, every single night for weeks. If you heard something breathing right behind your neck when you thought you were completely alone, what is the first thing you would do? Story 9. My roommate traveled a lot for work around the time I discovered the beach figures in the fog. So when I heard him talking in his room at 3 a.m., I knew something was wrong. He wasn't home. It was late October. I'm Daniel. I was 24, living in a cheap rental house right on the coast of Washington State. My roommate, Mark, was a sales rep who took off for days at a time. I was used to being alone in that drafty old house. It was usually peaceful, just the sound of the ocean and the wind, but that night was completely different. The voice I heard was muffled but unmistakable. It sounded exactly like Mark. It had that low, casual tone he always used. I sat up in bed. My room was down the hall from his. The house was completely dark except for moonlight coming through my blinds. I rubbed my eyes. Had his trip gotten canceled? I threw off my blankets and stepped onto the cold hardwood floor. The hallway floorboards squeaked loudly. I made my way toward his door. The talking stopped instantly. The sudden silence made my stomach drop. I knocked lightly on the wood and called out his name. Nothing. I pushed the door open. The street lamp outside cast a dim glow into the empty room. His bed was perfectly made. His travel bags were gone. The room was freezing. I realized his window was open just a crack. The salty ocean breeze was blowing the curtains inward. I stood there, feeling a sudden chill. I walked over to the window to shut it. The back of the house faced right out onto the beach. As I grabbed the frame, I stopped. A thick, heavy fog had rolled in off the ocean. You could barely see the water line, but through the mist, out in the water, I saw dark silhouettes breaking up the gray. There were 3 of them. They looked like tall people standing in the ocean. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it, but something was completely wrong. They were standing too far out. The tide was high, and the water out there had to be at least 10 feet deep. But these figures were just standing there, visible from the waist up. They weren't moving at all. The heavy ocean waves pounded the shore, but the figures didn't sway. They didn't brace themselves against the current. They were completely still, like stone statues carved into the water. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what my eyes were seeing. Then the fog shifted slightly. The moonlight caught one of the figures perfectly. My heart started hammering violently. It didn't have a face. It was just a smooth, dark, wet shape where a head should be. No features, no eyes catching the light, just an empty blank space. And then the one on the far left tilted its head. It didn't turn its body. It just snapped its head to the side, looking straight at Mark's open window, straight at me. I slammed the window shut and locked it. I pulled the curtains tight and backed away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely form a fist. I ran back to my room. I checked my phone. It was 3:15 a.m. I tried to convince myself it was just pareidolia, your brain trying to find human shapes in the dark. I got back into bed and pulled the heavy blankets up to my chin. I left my bedside lamp on. The house felt too big now, too empty. I just wanted the sun to come up. Then I heard it again. The talking started again. This time it wasn't coming from Mark's empty room. It was coming from outside. It was muffled by the exterior walls, but it was definitely a voice, a low, continuous sound. It sounded like a conversation, but there were no natural pauses for breathing, just a rambling stream of words. I sat up slowly. It started near the back deck and then shifted along the side of the house. It was moving steadily toward my bedroom window. I held my breath. The voice stopped right outside my window. There was a narrow side yard between my room and the dune fence. Whoever it was stood right there in the dark. Then the tapping started, tap, 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 slow and deliberate. It sounded like a hard fingernail hitting the glass. My blood ran completely cold. The tapping stopped. A long minute passed in absolute silence. I thought maybe they had left, but then the voice spoke again. This time it was clear. It was pressed right up against the glass. It sounded exactly like Mark. It was his voice, but flat and emotionless, like a broken recording. It was saying something he had told me earlier that week. Did you lock the back door? The wind blows it open. He had said that exact sentence to me 3 days ago. How could someone outside know that? The realization hit me. Whatever was out there had been listening to us. I slowly slid out of bed, staying low to the ground. My window blinds were pulled up about an inch from the sill. I crawled over to the wall. I pressed my back against the drywall directly below the window frame. I could hear wet, squelching sounds outside. It sounded like bare feet sinking heavily into the muddy sand. I took a deep breath. I raised my head just enough to peek through the tiny gap at the bottom of the blinds. Standing in the thick white mist, not even a foot away from the window, was a pair of legs. Gray, pale, unnatural skin, covered in wet sand and dark seaweed. Murky water dripped off them in steady drops. I couldn't see the upper body, just those unnaturally long, thin legs. They were standing perfectly still. The wet, squelching sound started again, but the legs I was looking at didn't move at all. The sound was coming from the back deck now. There was more than one of them. The other figures from the water had moved. They were out of the ocean. They were at the house. I dropped back down to the floor instantly. The voice started again, but this time it was coming from the sliding glass door in the living room. It was Mark's hollow voice again. Did you lock the back door? Panic set in deep. Did I lock it? I had opened it earlier that evening. I couldn't remember if I threw the latch when I closed it. I had to go check. If that door was unlocked, they could just slide it open. I crawled on my hands and knees out of my bedroom. The hallway was completely dark. I reached the edge of the living room. Beyond the glass, the deck was swallowed by the fog. Standing on the wooden deck were two figures. They were incredibly tall. Their heads nearly brushed the top of the door frame. They didn't have faces. One of them slowly raised a pale arm. It placed a massive hand flat against the glass right in front of me. The hand only had 4 unnaturally long fingers. I looked down at the handle. The metal latch was flipped up. It was locked. I let out a heavy breath of relief. Suddenly, the figure tilted its head. And then the voice spoke again, but it didn't come from the deck outside. "Did you lock the back door?" The voice came from right behind me, from inside the dark living room. I froze entirely. The air smelled suddenly of rotting fish. The window in Mark's room, the one that was cracked open, one of them had already come inside. I heard a wet, squelching footstep on the carpet directly behind my shoulder. I didn't turn around. I lunged forward, unlocked the sliding glass door, and shoved past the 2 tall figures standing on the deck. One reached out, its freezing wet fingers brushing my shoulder. I bolted into the dunes, running blindly through the fog toward the road. I made it to my car, locked the doors, and sped away. I drove until sunrise, never returning to that house. I still don't know what those ancient things were. The terrifying realization still haunts me. I was hiding from the things outside, completely unaware the third one was standing right outside my open bedroom door, just waiting in the dark. If you realized something mimicking a loved one was standing right behind you in the dark, what would your immediate reaction be? Story 10. I found a hidden folder on my laptop one morning after my terrifying experience with a gym locker. When I opened it, the pictures inside showed me sleeping every single night. My name is Kevin, and I want to explain exactly how I ended up making that horrible discovery. I have always been somewhat of a night owl, struggling to sleep until the sun comes up. I have always felt more awake in the dark, but this experience ruined that for me completely. A few months ago, I joined a 24-hour fitness center a few miles from my apartment. It was an older, standalone brick building nestled at the back of a slightly run-down strip mall. I preferred going there late, usually around 11:30 p.m., just to avoid the crowds. There is something peaceful about lifting weights when the rest of the city is asleep. Usually it was just me and maybe 1 or 2 other regulars who kept entirely to themselves. The front desk was supposed to be staffed all night, but the guy working the graveyard shift usually spent his time in the back office watching movies. So for the most part, you were completely on your own in there. I liked the isolation at first. It gave me time to clear my head. But when you are alone in a large, echoing building, your mind can sometimes play tricks on you. You start to hear things over the steady hum of the air conditioning, a heavy metal weight plate shifting, a treadmill belt turning over in the distance. I always ignored those sounds, brushing them off as old building noises settling in the night. I really wish I had paid more attention to them. If I had, maybe I would have realized I was not actually alone. It was a Tuesday night when things finally took a turn for the worse. I arrived at the gym around midnight. It had been raining heavily all evening, a cold, miserable downpour. The rain was coming down in thick, blinding sheets, creating loud splashing noises across the asphalt. When I pulled into the empty parking lot, mine was the only car there, apart from the employee's rusty sedan parked near the dumpster. I swiped my key fob, heard the mechanical click of the heavy lock, and pushed the thick glass door open. The front desk was entirely empty, exactly as I expected it to be. I walked past the desk and headed straight for the men's locker room to drop off my heavy duffel bag. The locker room was situated down a narrow, windowless hallway near the back of the building. It was a poorly lit, rectangular room with 3 long rows of dented gray metal lockers. The fluorescent lights overhead always buzzed with a low, irritating electrical hum. I walked down the middle aisle, tossing my bag into locker number 42. I did not bother putting a padlock on it. I just pushed the metal door shut, grabbed my water bottle, and headed out to the main gym floor. I spent the next hour and a half working out. The entire time, the gym was dead silent. I felt completely isolated, but in a way that felt productive and calm. Around 1:30 a.m., my muscles were exhausted, and I decided to call it a night. I wiped down the bench I was using and began the short walk back down the narrow hallway toward the locker room. As I pushed open the heavy wooden door to the men's room, a wave of cold air instantly hit my face. It felt significantly colder in there than it had been out on the main gym floor. I rubbed my arms, shivering slightly as I walked down the middle aisle toward my locker. The buzzing of the overhead lights seemed louder somehow, almost like an angry swarm echoing in the empty space. I reached my locker, pulled the metal latch, and grabbed my duffel bag from inside. I tossed it onto the heavy wooden bench directly behind me and started changing. That was when I heard it. It was a slow, agonizing creak of ungreased metal hinges. The sound echoed sharply in the completely silent room. I froze instantly, my shirt pulled halfway over my head. I slowly lowered the shirt and looked straight down the aisle. About 4 lockers away from mine, on the exact same row, a locker door was slowly swinging open. It moved deliberately, inch by inch, as if someone was gently pushing it outward from the inside. I stood perfectly still, my heart suddenly hammering hard against my ribs. I knew for an absolute fact that every single locker in this row had been firmly closed when I walked in. The metal door finally came to a complete stop, resting wide open. I waited for someone to step out, expecting maybe another late-night member, but no one appeared. "Hello," I called out hesitantly. My voice sounded weak and shaky. There was no response, just absolute heavy silence. I took a deep breath, desperately trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe the latch was just broken and the draft had somehow blown it open. I forced my trembling legs to move. I took a few slow, incredibly hesitant steps toward the open locker. The closer I got, the colder the air actually seemed to feel. I nervously peered inside the dark, rectangular space. It was completely empty. Just a bare, empty metal box. I let out a heavy sigh of relief, feeling incredibly stupid for being so paranoid. I reached out to grab the cold metal handle and pushed the door firmly shut, but as my fingers briefly brushed the inside of the door, I violently pulled my hand back in shock. The metal was wet. I leaned in much closer, squinting against the harsh overhead light. The entire inside of the metal door, as well as the dark back wall of the locker, was completely coated in a thick layer of fresh condensation. It was covered in tiny water droplets, slowly sliding down the metal surface. It looked exactly like a car window when someone is breathing heavily inside on a very cold day. My stomach dropped violently into my shoes. Air conditioning could never do that. That required warm, moist air, like human breath. Panicked and terrified, I slammed the locker door shut. The loud metallic bang echoed through the empty room. I stared at the closed door, my mind racing. Then it happened. From inside the closed, empty locker, something knocked back. It was 2 slow, incredibly deliberate taps against the metal door. Thump, thump. All the remaining blood drained from my face. I stumbled backward in sheer terror, tripping awkwardly, and fell hard onto the tile floor. As I scrambled to get up, my car keys slipped from my pocket and slid directly under the long wooden bench. I did not care about the keys at first. My only thought was to get out of that room, but without them I was completely trapped there. I dropped to my hands and knees, my eyes still locked in blind panic on the closed locker door, and blindly reached under the heavy wooden bench. My fingers frantically searched the cold tile until they brushed the familiar metal of my keyring. As I closed my shaking hand around the keys, I instinctively glanced under the bench. The space beneath the thick wooden slats was mostly shadowed, but the harsh floor reflection illuminated it just enough to see. Wedged completely flat beneath the bench, just inches away from my hand, was a pair of pale, bare feet. They were not moving at all. They were just waiting silently in the dark, pointed directly at me. Someone was lying perfectly still under the very bench I had just been sitting on. A strangled gasp escaped my dry throat. I did not dare look closer. I did not try to see a face hidden in the shadows. I violently yanked my keys out, scrambled to my feet, and sprinted out of the locker room without looking back. I burst through the front doors of the gym into the pouring rain and peeled out of the parking lot. I ran into my apartment and locked every door, but I still felt like I was being watched. That is when I opened my laptop to distract myself and found that horrible folder of pictures. Now, I know whatever was hiding in the locker room that night followed me home. If you realized a hidden stranger had been documenting you while you slept, what would be your very first move? Story 11. It was the first late night at a subway station I spent completely alone. I thought the silence would be peaceful, until I realized it wasn't silence at all. I was 22 at the time, working an exhausting closing shift at a diner downtown. Usually my manager let me out by 10 p.m., but that night we were understaffed and cleaning took way longer. By the time I locked the glass doors and walked to the station, it was past midnight. The city was dead. It was a cold Tuesday night in November, and the streets were completely empty. No cars, no people, just me, pulling my bright yellow winter coat tight to block the freezing wind. All I wanted was to get home and sleep. I walked down the concrete steps into the underground station. The smell of old iron and stale air hit me. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a low hum. A few bulbs flickered rapidly, casting jumping shadows across the grimy walls. I swiped my transit card and pushed through the metal turnstiles. The loud clack of the bars echoed down the hallway. It sounded way too loud. That was my first clue of how isolated the place was. Usually there's at least a janitor or a transit worker in the booth. But there was absolutely no one. The platform was completely deserted. I walked to the edge, stopping behind the yellow warning tiles. The tracks below looked like endless black rivers. I checked the time. Exactly 12:45 a.m. My phone battery was at 14%. I had no cell service down there, but the low battery icon just added to my unease. I tried to shake it off. I took this train almost every single day. There was nothing to be afraid of. I started packing to stay warm. The platform was long, lined with faded posters and thick concrete pillars. My boots made sharp tapping noises. Tap, tap, tap. They echoed against the low ceiling. I noticed a crushed, bright red coffee cup sitting near a wooden bench. Someone had stepped on it and left it there. I stared at it, letting my tired brain rest. Then the overhead speaker crackled to life. A sudden burst of static made me flinch. An automated voice echoed through the empty station. It was a woman's voice, calm, professional, and slightly robotic. The next northbound train will arrive in 15 minutes. I let out a breath. 15 minutes was a long wait underground, but at least I had a timeline. I sat down on the uncomfortable bench near that crushed red coffee cup. I crossed my arms and stared at the dirty tiles on the opposite wall. About 3 minutes slowly passed. The silence started to feel incredibly heavy. It felt like a physical pressure against my ears. When it gets too quiet, your brain invents sounds to fill the void. Every shifting draft sounded like a footstep. The speaker overhead crackled again. The next northbound train will arrive in 15 minutes. I frowned. I checked my phone. It was 12:48 a.m. 3 minutes had passed. The timing system was probably glitching, stuck on a repeating loop. It happens with outdated infrastructure. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a broken timer. 2 silent minutes went by. The speaker crackled again. It sounded louder this time. The static was sharper, almost like thick paper tearing near my ear. The next northbound train will arrive in 15 minutes. Now it was getting annoying, but something else bothered me. I stood up and walked closer to the nearest speaker mounted high on the ceiling. 60 seconds later, the harsh static ripped through the dead air. The next northbound train will arrive in 15 minutes. A freezing chill ran down my spine. The voice had changed slightly. Automated subway voices are pieced together from pre-recorded audio. Every syllable has the same artificial tone, but this time the voice didn't sound pieced together. It sounded like someone was actually speaking live into a microphone. The word arrived dragged on just a tiny fraction of a second too long. My throat felt incredibly dry. I looked around the massive platform, searching for security cameras. There had to be someone in a control room messing with the system. Maybe some bored worker was playing a prank. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded weak, echoing down the tunnel. Nobody answered. I kept my eyes glued to the pitch-black tunnel where my train was supposed to come from. I prayed I would see headlights. The dull feeling in my stomach twisted into genuine panic. The speaker hissed again. The harsh static lingered for several long seconds. Then the voice spoke. "The northbound train will arrive in 15 minutes. My breath caught in my throat. The word next was gone, and the voice wasn't robotic anymore. It was completely human. It sounded exactly like a real woman in a quiet room speaking directly into a microphone, but what terrified me most was the tone. It sounded genuinely amused. I backed away, retreating until my back hit the tiled wall near the stairs. I wanted to run back up to the street, but walking alone in the dark city at 1 a.m. felt just as dangerous. The static blasted again, so loud it actually hurt my ears. I looked up. The yellow coat will arrive in 15 minutes. My heart slammed against my ribs. I froze, looking down at my bright, unmistakable yellow winter coat. The voice was talking about me. I wasn't just hearing things in the white noise. I spun around, scanning every shadowy corner of the station. Behind the pillars, near the ticket machines, nothing. It was completely dead. The only movement was a loose piece of trash fluttering in the draft. My hands shook wildly. I pulled my phone out again. 13% battery, still no service. I frantically toggled airplane mode, praying for a single bar to call for help. It just kept searching. I realized I couldn't stay down here. Whoever was watching me, they had total control of the audio. They could clearly see me. I grabbed my heavy bag and broke into a dead sprint toward the exit stairs. I didn't care about the cold outside. I just needed to leave immediately. As I took my first running step, every single speaker up and down the massive platform activated at the exact same time. The sound entirely surrounded me. "Where is the yellow coat going?" The voice wasn't calm anymore. It was laced with a strange, distorted anger. The volume was deafening. I ran past the concrete pillars and the wooden benches. My boot slammed down on that crushed red coffee cup, sending it skittering over the edge and onto the dark tracks. I reached the base of the stairs, my lungs burned from the dusty air. I grabbed the cold handrail and started taking the concrete steps 2 at a time. I didn't dare look back. I was terrified I would see someone standing right behind me. Halfway up the stairwell, the static hissed one last time. This time, it didn't come from the overhead speakers. It echoed directly out from the dark, empty tunnel I had just left behind. It rolled up the stairs after me, carrying on the freezing draft. The voice was low and breathless, like whoever was speaking was standing at the bottom of the stairs, staring directly up at my back. "You missed your train." I stumbled, my knee slamming hard into the step. I scrambled up on my hands and knees, pushing forward. I hit the turnstiles, shoving them with my whole body weight. They spun wildly as I threw myself through. I ran up the final flight of stairs and burst out into the night air. I ran down the middle of the street, staying under the streetlights. I didn't stop until I found an all-night gas station 10 blocks away. I locked myself in their dirty restroom and sat on the floor, shaking until the sun came up. The next morning, I saw a local news report. The transit authority announced that the northbound subway line had been completely shut down the night before due to a massive electrical failure. The power to the tracks had been entirely cut at 11:30 p.m. There were no trains running that entire night. The tracks were dead. Whoever was watching me speaking through those speakers, they fully knew no train was ever coming to save me. They just wanted to keep me down there in the dark, waiting. If you were completely alone underground and the announcements started talking about you, what would be your first move? Story 12. Back in the months before I took a summer job at a remote firewatch tower, I worked the night shift at a gas station. I used to think the scariest thing I'd see was a drunk customer. I was wrong. I left that job because I was exhausted from dealing with the public. I wanted total isolation. I found an opening for a seasonal lookout up in the Pacific Northwest. You lived in a small glass box high above the tree line for 3 months, just you, the wilderness, and a 2-way radio. It sounded perfect. The hike from where I parked to the tower took 3 hours on foot. When I climbed the steep wooden steps and pushed open the trapdoor, the view was incredible. Endless miles of dark green pine trees. Inside, the cabin was small but livable. There was a narrow cot, a small stove, a map, and a heavy black radio console sitting on the desk. Next to the radio, there was a cracked yellow coffee mug left behind by whoever worked here last. I used it as a pen holder. The strange events began on a Tuesday night around 11:30 p.m. I was sitting at the desk writing in the logbook. The wind was completely dead. Suddenly, the heavy radio crackled loudly. This was unusual. The frequency was strictly for noon check-ins and emergencies. At night, it was always silent. Through the static, I heard a voice. It was incredibly faint, like a whisper from far away. I pressed the talk button and asked if anyone needed assistance. The static just hissed back. After a minute, the signal died. I brushed it off and went asleep. 2 nights passed without anything else happening, but on Friday night, things changed. It was well past midnight. Around 2:15 a.m., I was in my sleeping bag, staring at the dark ceiling. Without warning, the radio burst to life again. There was no static this time. It was a perfectly clear, open mic channel. You could hear the hollow sound of an empty room in the background. Then a voice spoke out. "Tower 7, do you copy?" the voice asked. I sat straight up. The hair on my arms stood up. I looked at the map. I was stationed at Tower 4. The nearest active tower was Tower 9, 50 miles away. There was no Tower 7. It had been destroyed decades ago. I picked up the mic, pressed the button firmly, and said, "Unknown station, this is Tower 4. There is no Tower 7 on this grid." I released the button. The room fell silent. 20 seconds passed. Then the radio clicked back on. "Tower 4, this is Tower 7. I have a visual." The voice was perfectly clear now, and that was the exact moment I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The cadence, the tone, the slight hesitation between the words. It sounded exactly like me. It was my own specific voice speaking back to me through the console. My hands started shaking violently as I held the microphone. I didn't press the button. How could someone possibly be mimicking my exact voice over an isolated radio frequency in the middle of nowhere? Before I could process the impossibility of the situation, the radio clicked again. The voice that sounded just like mine spoke one more time. "Luke, do you see it in the trees?" He used my real name. A cold wave of dread washed over me. I felt entirely exposed in that transparent glass box illuminated only by moonlight. I slowly placed the microphone down, trying not to make a sound. My heart was hammering. I didn't want to look outside, but the terrifying question hung in the air. I stepped carefully toward the windows. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass to block the glare from the radio dial. I stared down into the dark expanse of the forest. At first, I didn't see anything unusual. Then my eyes adjusted to the dark. About 100 yards out from the base of my tower, there was a gap in the tree line. Standing directly in the middle of that clearing, there was a shape. It was massive. It was taller than any animal out here, and its proportions were wrong. It didn't look human, but it was standing upright. Its form was blurry, like a dark shadow that had somehow pulled itself out of the ground. The dark figure was standing perfectly still, facing the tower. I stared down at it, too completely terrified to take a shallow breath. My eyes started to burn terribly from not blinking, watering from the heavy strain. Finally, I couldn't hold my eyes open any longer. I blinked. It was just a fraction of a second. But when my eyelids snapped open again, the massive thing was significantly closer. It had silently crossed 20 yards in the blink of an eye. There was no snapping of dry branches. It had simply shifted position while my vision was broken. Panic took over. I stumbled backward quickly. As I backed away, my elbow clipped the wooden desk. I knocked over the yellow coffee mug that held my pens. It hit the floorboards and shattered. The sound of breaking ceramic echoed loudly in the cramped room. I froze, terrified that the noise had alerted whatever was standing down there. I dropped down to my hands and knees and crawled carefully back to the edge of the window. I raised my head just enough so my eyes were barely over the wooden sill. I looked back out at the gap in the trees. The massive shape was gone. The open space in the trees was completely empty. I felt a very brief, desperate surge of relief. I tried to tell myself that my exhausted mind was just playing tricks on me, but then a horrible realization hit me. The moonlight was casting a very long, strange shadow across the dirt clearing directly below my observation deck. I couldn't see the massive thing in the trees anymore because it wasn't out in the forest. It was standing directly underneath my tower, at the very base of the long wooden staircase. The silence in the small room became utterly suffocating. I didn't know what to do. The heavy trapdoor was securely bolted shut, but the tower was made of nothing but old wood and thin glass. If something that massive wanted to get inside, a simple wooden bolt was not going to stop it. I waited in the dark, listening for the sound of heavy weight on the stairs. Suddenly, the radio on the desk hissed to life one last time. I stayed crouched on the hard floor, staring blindly at the glowing green dial. The sharp static cleared perfectly, and my own exact voice drifted softly through the speaker. It sounded flat, hollow, and devoid of emotion. The voice simply said, "It sees you now." The radio abruptly clicked off. A second later, the power light on the console died completely. The tower lost its battery power. I was plunged into total darkness. I stayed curled tightly into a ball on the floor, listening with everything I had. For the rest of the endless night, I heard nothing. There were no heavy footsteps creeping up the stairs. There was only the agonizing silence of the isolated forest. But the entire time, I had the terrible feeling that something incredibly large was standing below my floorboards, patiently waiting. I didn't dare move until the first gray light of dawn broke through the windows. When the sun actually rose, I slowly stood up. I looked down through the glass. There was absolutely nothing there, no tracks in the dirt and no broken branches. I didn't even bother packing my clothes. I grabbed my car keys, unbolted the heavy trapdoor, and ran down those steep wooden steps faster than I ever have in my entire life. I hiked the 3 miles back down the rough trail without looking behind me a single time. I drove straight back to civilization and never returned to that forest. I completely abandoned the job and everything I left inside the tower. I still have no idea what was standing at the edge of the trees that night, but I know exactly what I heard coming through that radio console. The thing that haunts me most isn't whatever massive shape was waiting silently at the bottom of my stairs. It is the deeply unsettling fact that whatever was out in the dark wilderness with me knew exactly how to sound just like me. If you were completely isolated in the woods and heard your own voice speaking back to you over a dead radio channel, how would you try to rationalize it? Story 13. This happened during the week I was moving my entire life into a temporary storage unit. Everyone was afraid of what was outside, but my fear came from inside my own house. Well, I should probably clarify that. At the time, my actual house was just an empty, echoing shell. Everything that made it mine, every piece of furniture, every memory, every random box of junk I owned, was currently sitting inside a rented unit on the outskirts of town. So in a way, that little metal room was my house, and the fear I experienced inside of it is something I still have trouble wrapping my head around. I was in my mid-20s and caught between leases. I had to be out of my old place by the end of the month, but my new apartment wouldn't be ready for another 3 weeks. My only option was to rent a temporary space at one of those massive, sprawling storage facilities right off Interstate 95. You probably know the exact kind of place I'm talking about. It was a giant, windowless concrete compound. Inside, it was just an endless maze of long, narrow hallways lined with bright orange roll-up doors. The whole building had this weird, sterile smell to it, like stale dust mixed with cheap cleaning chemicals. The fluorescent lights overhead always buzzed with this low, irritating hum that you could actually feel in your teeth if the hallway was quiet enough. Doing the move completely by myself took much longer than I expected. I was making multiple trips a day in my small sedan, loading whatever I could fit in the trunk and the backseat, driving over to the facility, and hauling it all inside. The management office let customers borrow these heavy-duty metal dollies to move stuff from the parking lot to the units. I always ended up grabbing the same one. It had a terribly squeaky front left wheel that echoed loudly off the concrete walls every time I pushed it down the hallway. I kind of hated that sound, but the facility was usually so empty and silent that the squeak actually gave me a weird sense of comfort. It broke up the dead, heavy quiet. My unit was number 412. It was tucked way in the back corner of the third floor, which meant a long walk from the freight elevator. According to my rental agreement, the space was 10 feet wide and 15 feet deep. When I first opened the roll-up door on day one, it looked exactly like that. Just a standard rectangular box with corrugated metal walls and a bare concrete floor. But by the third day of moving, things started to feel a little off. I had already filled up about half the unit. I was trying to be organized, stacking the heaviest boxes against the back wall to save space near the front. As I was pushing a particularly heavy box of books toward the back, I remember stopping and just staring at the wall for a second. It looked farther away than it had the day before. I blinked a few times, rubbing my eyes. Exhausted and running on way too much coffee, I figured my brain was just playing tricks on me. The lighting in the unit wasn't great to begin with, and the shadows cast by my stacked boxes were probably just making the space look deeper than it actually was. I shoved the box of books into place, locked up the door, and went back to my old apartment to pack another load. The real nightmare happened on my very last trip. It was around 11:30 p.m. I had finally packed up the last few loose items from my kitchen, shoved them into some black garbage bags, and tossed them in the car. It had started raining heavily outside, a freezing, relentless downpour that hammered against my windshield. I had to return my apartment keys the next morning, so I had absolutely no choice but to finish the job right then. When I pulled into the storage facility parking lot, mine was the only car there. The automatic sliding doors parted for me, and I grabbed my usual squeaky dolly from the lobby. The sound of that front wheel squealing against the tile seemed 10 times louder in the completely empty building. I rode the freight elevator up to the third floor. The hallway stretching down to Unit 412 felt miles long in the dark. The fluorescent lights flickered slightly as I walked, casting long, jittery shadows against the row of orange doors. When I reached my unit, I punched in my passcode on the padlock, slid the heavy latch, and hauled the metal door upward. It rumbled loudly as it coiled into the ceiling. I reached in and pulled the string for the single overhead light bulb inside my unit. It clicked on, casting a dim, yellowish glow over all my belongings. I grabbed my first couple of bags off the dolly and stepped inside. I walked past my mattress, past my couch, and headed toward the back where I had left some open floor space. But as I kept walking, I realized something was terribly wrong. I had taken at least 10 steps. In a 15-foot deep room, 10 steps should have put me right against the back wall, but I wasn't at the wall. The space just kept going. I stopped, freezing dead in my tracks. A cold, heavy knot formed in the pit of my stomach. I looked down at the floor, then slowly looked up. The back wall of corrugated metal was entirely gone. Instead, the unit simply extended backward into total darkness. It was as if the metal walls had just dissolved, giving way to a vast, open cavern of bare concrete that stretched far beyond the actual physical dimensions of the building itself. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't understand what I was looking at. It felt like my brain was completely short-circuiting. Buildings don't just stretch like this. Rooms don't just expand into nowhere. I really should have turned around right then. I should have dropped my bags and run. But human curiosity is a dangerous thing. My mind desperately wanted to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to find some sort of logical explanation. Maybe the management had knocked down a wall for sudden renovations. Maybe my unit strangely connected to a larger warehouse space I hadn't noticed before. Taking a deep breath, I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I aimed the bright beam into the dark expanse ahead of me and took a few slow, hesitant steps forward. The air back here was noticeably colder. It didn't smell like the sterile cleaning chemicals from the hallway anymore. It smelled incredibly old. It smelled like damp earth, rotting paper, and stale sweat. As my flashlight swept across the thick gloom, the beam caught something in the distance. Boxes. There were massive stacks of cardboard boxes rising up from the floor, maybe 30 feet deep into this impossible space, but they weren't my boxes. Mine were clearly labeled with black marker and neatly taped shut. These boxes were blank, heavily damaged, and covered in a thick, undisturbed layer of dust. They weren't just randomly placed, either. They were stacked intentionally, arranged into strange, curving walls and narrow pathways. It looked like someone had built a crude, makeshift labyrinth out of garbage. I took another step closer, my hand trembling so badly the flashlight beam shook against the cardboard. As I approached the first stack of boxes, I noticed something that made my blood run ice cold. Arranged on the floor behind the cardboard wall was a flattened, filthy mattress. Next to it was a small pile of food wrappers, a few empty water bottles, and a battery-powered lantern. Someone was living back here. Deep inside this hidden, physically impossible pocket of space, someone had made a home. Panic finally set in, hitting me hard and fast. I realized how incredibly vulnerable I was. I was standing in the dark in an empty building, discovering a hidden space that clearly belonged to someone or something else. I spun around to immediately head back to the brightly lit hallway. When I looked back toward the entrance of my unit, a choked gasp escaped my lips. The orange roll-up door was just a tiny, glowing square in the far distance. It looked like it was at least 50 or 60 feet away. It was like I was looking through the wrong end of a telescope. The sheer impossibility of the distance made my head spin. I felt a sudden wave of severe vertigo, almost losing my balance. Then I heard it. It didn't come from the hallway, it came from the darkness directly behind me. Scrape. It was the distinct, heavy sound of a cardboard box being slowly pushed across the concrete floor. I froze, every single muscle in my body tensing. The silence that followed was completely suffocating. I strained my ears, listening intently into the dark. For a moment there was nothing, but then I heard a different sound. Squeak, squeak, squeak. It was the high-pitched, metallic squeal of a dolly wheel, the exact same sound the dolly I had left out in the hallway always made. But the sound wasn't coming from the brightly lit hallway. It was coming from deeper inside the labyrinth of dusty boxes, moving slowly but steadily in my direction. I didn't wait to see what was pushing it. I sprinted toward the tiny square of light in the distance. I ran faster than I ever have in my entire life, my shoes slapping loudly against the cold concrete. The distance seemed to take forever to close, like I was running in a nightmare where the hallway just kept endlessly stretching away from me. Behind me, the squeaking sound sped up. It wasn't a casual push anymore. Whatever was back there was moving fast, aggressively chasing me toward the exit. I burst through the threshold of my unit, gasping for air as I stumbled back into the bright, buzzing fluorescent lights of the normal hallway. I didn't even look back over my shoulder. I grabbed the heavy metal handle of the roll-up door and slammed it down with all my remaining strength. It hit the floor with a deafening crash that aggressively echoed down the long corridor. My hands were shaking violently as I frantically fumbled with my padlock. I snapped it shut, locking it securely in place. I backed away from the orange door, my chest heaving. For a long, terrifying minute, I just stared at the corrugated metal, waiting to see if something was going to hit the door from the inside. But nothing did. The only sound left in the building was the low, irritating hum of the overhead lights. I left my dolly right there in the empty hallway. I speed-walked to the elevator, rode it down to the lobby, and ran out into the freezing rain to my car. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped out of the parking lot without ever looking back. I never returned to that facility. I left every single thing I owned locked inside Unit 412. My furniture, my clothes, my pictures, none of it mattered anymore. The thought of ever opening that door again, of looking into that impossible, stretching darkness and seeing what was waiting for me, was far more terrifying than starting my life over with absolutely nothing. I still pay the monthly rental fee for that unit, every single month, exactly on time. I don't pay it to keep my belongings safe. I pay it because I want to make absolutely sure that nobody ever opens that door again. If you discovered an impossible space hiding right behind your own belongings, what would you have done in my situation? Story 14. This happened on a cold hotel night. I thought the tapping on my window was just branches, but it was. I was driving cross-country for a new job. It was a long trip, and I was trying to cover as much ground as possible. By the time I reached the Midwest, I was completely exhausted. My eyes were burning, and the highway lines were starting to blur together. I knew I had to pull over. I took the next exit and found a generic, cheap hotel sitting off the interstate. I just wanted a bed. I checked in at the front desk with a clerk who barely looked up from his phone. He handed me a keycard for room 314. The third-floor hallway smelled like old cigarettes. The carpet was a dark, dizzying geometric pattern. I found my room right at the end of the hall. I dropped my bags and crashed onto the mattress. I fell asleep almost immediately, but a few hours later I woke up. The clock read 2:30 a.m. The room was freezing. I pulled the thin blanket tighter around me, trying to go back to sleep. That was when I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the window. At first, I figured it was just the wind blowing a branch against the glass, but then I remembered I was on the third floor. There were no trees outside my window, just the empty parking lot 3 stories down. It stopped, then started again, harder this time. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I stared at the heavy curtains. Every instinct told me to ignore it, but the tapping was too rhythmic, too intentional. I finally forced myself to get up. I slowly walked over to the window, my bare feet sinking into the cheap carpet. I grabbed the edge of the curtain and pulled it back just a fraction of an inch. There was nothing there, just the dark, empty night. I closed the curtain and turned back toward the bed, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. The room suddenly felt incredibly small and suffocating. I decided I needed a soda from the vending machine to break the tension. I grabbed my room key and opened the door, stepping out into the quiet hallway. The hallway was completely silent, but it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was that heavy, dead feeling you only get late at night when the rest of the world is asleep and you feel completely isolated. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low, irritating buzz that seemed to drill right into my temples. A bulb a few feet away flickered slightly against the peeling wallpaper. I looked down the long corridor toward the elevator. It stretched out like a tunnel. I started walking. My footsteps were completely muffled by the thick old carpet. It felt weirdly isolated, like I was the only person left in the entire building. I passed door after door, all completely quiet. Halfway down the hall, I passed a generic piece of hotel art, a faded landscape of a lake with mountains. I didn't really think much of it at the time. I just glanced at it and kept walking. As I kept walking, it started to feel like the hallway wasn't ending. I kept waiting to see the vending machines, but they didn't appear. I felt a slight knot form in my stomach. I had been walking for at least 2 minutes. A hotel hallway shouldn't be this long. I stopped and looked around. The flickering light I had noticed earlier was now right above me. I frowned. That didn't make sense. I should have passed that light a while ago. I slowly turned my head, looking at the wall to my right. Hanging there, perfectly centered and right at eye level, was the exact same painting of the lake and the mountains. The same cheap, faded frame. The same washed-out green trees. It was identical in every single way. I tried to rationalize it. Cheap hotels buy identical art in bulk. It made sense they would hang the same picture twice. I was just tired and letting my imagination get the better of me. I started walking again. This time I picked up my pace. I wanted to get this over with. I jogged slightly, watching the doors pass by. Room 308, room 306, wait. I stopped dead in my tracks. The door to my left said room 314, my room. I reached out and touched the brass numbers just to make sure they were real. The metal was freezing cold. It didn't make any sense. I had been walking in a straight line away from my room. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't taken any stairs. I had just walked straight down the center of the hallway. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, my hands suddenly trembling. I swiped my keycard against the lock. The little light flashed red. It didn't open. I tried it again. Red light. The door was locked and my key wasn't working. Panic started to bubble up in my chest. I turned around and looked back the way I came. The hallway stretched out endlessly in that direction too. The same dizzying carpet, the same peeling wallpaper. I took a deep breath. Maybe I was just disoriented. Maybe the hotel had a weird circular layout that I hadn't noticed when I checked in. I decided to just keep walking forward. Eventually I had to hit the elevator or a stairwell. Building's end, that is just a fact. I started walking again, faster this time, almost a run. The silence in the hallway felt heavier now, pressing against my eardrums. I passed the painting again, keeping my eyes fixed on the end of the hall. But there was no end, just more doors, more ugly carpet. The air felt stale and thick. I passed a dark stain on the carpet. It looked like an old coffee spill. I recognized it. I had stepped over that exact same stain right after I left my room the first time. I stopped again. I was trapped. I was completely trapped in this repeating section of hallway. I walked over to the nearest door and pounded on it frantically. "Hey," I yelled. My voice sounded weirdly muffled, like the walls were absorbing the sound. "Is anyone in there? Please, I need help." Nothing, no movement inside, no voices, just dead silence. I ran across the hall and pounded on room 311. Help, somebody open the door. Still nothing. I tried the handle, locked. I went down the line, pulling on every door handle. They were all locked solid. I backed away from the doors, stepping backward until I was standing dead in the center of the hallway. My hands were shaking violently now. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to hold it together, but I didn't know what to do. The fear was completely paralyzing, creeping up my spine like ice water. I wasn't just lost. Something was very, very wrong with this place. I slowly turned. The painting of the lake was right next to me again. I hadn't wanted to look at it, but my eyes were drawn to it like a magnet. I stepped closer. The lighting above it flickered, casting a strange yellow glow over the canvas. At first glance, it was the same faded landscape, but as I stared at it, I realized something was different. There was a shadow near the edge of the lake that hadn't been there before. I leaned in, my heart stopped. It wasn't a shadow. It was a person standing in the background, half hidden by trees. They were looking out of the frame, right at me. I couldn't look away. The small details were horrifyingly clear. The figure was wearing the exact same gray t-shirt and dark jeans I had on. I forced my eyes up to the figure's face. It was my face. The face was twisted into a massive, unnatural smile with wide, empty eyes, a hollow, mocking copy of me. A wave of pure, unfiltered terror crashed over me, so intense it made my vision blur. I stumbled backward, my legs giving out slightly, and hit the opposite wall hard with my shoulder. The air in the hallway suddenly dropped by at least 20 degrees in an instant. I could clearly see my breath fogging in the air, hanging in front of my face in small white clouds. And then, from the far end of the hallway, out of the darkness where the lights had completely burned out, I heard a sound. It was a slow, heavy footstep, muffled by the carpet but unmistakable. Someone was walking toward me. I didn't think, I just ran. I bolted in the opposite direction, sprinting past the locked doors and flickering lights. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. I didn't care about the loop anymore. I just knew I couldn't let whatever made that footstep catch me. Just as I felt like my lungs were about to give out, I suddenly slammed shoulder first into a heavy metal fire exit door. I swear on my life it hadn't been there a second ago, but I didn't care enough to question it. I threw my entire body weight against the crash bar and tumbled forward into a concrete stairwell, scraping my knees on the rough landing. The heavy door slammed shut behind me, cutting off the buzzing lights and the suffocating silence of the hallway. I practically fell down 3 flights of stairs to the lobby. I sprinted to the front desk, gasping for air. I demanded the clerk check me out immediately. Bizarrely, when he escorted me back upstairs to grab my bags, the hallway was perfectly normal. The endless loop was gone, but the painting was still there, empty background and all. I drove away into the freezing night and never went back. I still check the backgrounds of paintings whenever I stay somewhere new. If you saw your own twisted reflection inside a piece of hotel art, what would you do? Story 15. During a late-night cruise, I was staying in a basement apartment. At first, the noises upstairs seemed normal, until I realized they weren't coming from upstairs. Technically, I wasn't in a basement at all. I was in the middle of the ocean on a massive, floating resort, but my cabin was located on the very bottom passenger deck of the ship. It was buried so deeply inside the steel hull of the vessel that it felt exactly like a cheap, cramped, windowless basement apartment. There was absolutely no natural light in that room. When you turned off the small bedside lamp on the nightstand, the darkness was absolute and suffocating. You could hold your own hand an inch from your face and see absolutely nothing. Because of where the room was located, you couldn't even hear the waves crashing against the side of the ship outside. Instead, you felt the constant, deep vibration of the ship's massive engines. It was a low, steady hum that vibrated through the floorboards and traveled straight up into your bones. Most nights, the sound acted like a heavy white noise. It was easy to ignore and actually helped you fall asleep. But on this particular night, the hum felt different. It felt heavy, aggressive, and entirely wrong. I was on this trip completely by myself. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a rare chance to disconnect from my stressful job and just enjoy the open water. For the first 3 days, it was exactly that. I spent my time lounging by the adult pool, reading thick paperback novels and avoiding the loud, crowded family areas. It felt peaceful. But on the 4th day, something subtly shifted in the atmosphere. I was sitting in the main buffet area around 1:15 in the afternoon. The massive dining room was crowded with large families and loud, running children. I had found a small, quiet table near the large glass windows overlooking the ocean. I was halfway through my lunch when I noticed a man sitting a few tables away from me. He looked entirely out of place in the bright room. While everyone else was wearing colorful vacation clothes and swimsuits, he was dressed in dark, heavy layers. He didn't have a plate of food in front of him. He didn't have a drink. He was just sitting there perfectly still, staring intently at his hands resting on the table. I tried to ignore him and go back to reading my book. You see plenty of strange or antisocial people on long vacations. But a few minutes later, I glanced up over the top of my pages again. He wasn't looking at his hands anymore. He had shifted his position in the chair. He was now staring directly at the large glass window right next to me. At first, I simply thought he was watching the waves roll by. Then I realized the angle of his head was completely wrong. He wasn't looking through the glass at the ocean outside. He was using the dark glare of the window to watch my reflection. I immediately felt a terrible cold chill run down my spine. It was that sharp primal instinct that suddenly tells your brain something is deeply wrong. My stomach dropped. I quickly packed up my things, grabbed my bag, and left the dining hall without looking back. I didn't want to see if he was watching me leave. I just wanted to get away from the area. I managed to brush off the weird encounter for the rest of the day. I convinced myself I was just being overly paranoid from spending too much time alone. I spent the evening attending a comedy show, had a few drinks at a crowded bar, and eventually made my way back down to my bottom deck cabin around 11:30 p.m. I went through my usual quiet nighttime routine. I shut the heavy metal door, making sure the thick deadbolt clicked firmly into place. I brushed my teeth in the tiny, cramped bathroom, trying to ignore how closely the walls seemed to press in on me. I turned off the main overhead lights, leaving only the small desk lamp glowing in the corner of the room. I climbed into bed and closed my eyes, waiting for the gentle rocking of the ship to put me to sleep. But sleep completely refused to come. The air in the tiny cabin felt incredibly thick and stale. The walls suddenly felt like they were slowly closing in on me. The darkness lingering outside the small circle of lamplight seemed oppressive and heavy. I tossed and turned for hours, unable to find a comfortable position. I kept checking the glowing digital clock on my phone. 1:15 a.m., 2:30 a.m., 3:15 a.m. By 3:30 in the morning, I finally accepted that I wasn't going to fall asleep. My mind was racing, and the intense claustrophobia of the windowless room was becoming completely unbearable. I decided I just needed to get out of the cabin for a few minutes. I needed to walk to an open area, get a glass of cold water, and breathe some fresh air to reset my brain. I slipped my shoes on, grabbed my plastic room keycard, and opened my cabin door. The corridor on deck 2 is impossibly long. It stretches so far in both directions that the distant ends seem to blur and fade into a hazy nothingness. The walls are lined with dozens of identical heavy metal doors. The carpet features a dizzying, repeating geometric pattern that plays weird tricks on your eyes if you stare at it for too long. At this late hour, the hallway was completely dead. There was no sound of distant televisions, no muffled conversations coming from the rooms, and no footsteps. There was just the low, aggressive hum of the engine vibrating beneath my feet. I started walking toward the midship elevators. The absolute silence was heavy and deeply unsettling. I felt completely exposed standing in the middle of the long, straight hallway. Every time I passed a closed door, I couldn't help but imagine someone standing right on the other side, pressing their ear to the wood and listening to my slow footsteps. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the up button. The wait felt agonizingly slow. When the arrival bell finally dinged, the bright, cheerful sound was shockingly loud in the quiet corridor. I stepped inside the mirrored car and pressed the button for Deck 9, which was the main Lido deck. The heavy doors slid shut and the elevator began its slow ascent. I watched the digital red numbers tick upward. 4, 5, 6. The mirrored walls of the elevator made me feel deeply uneasy. I was forced to look at my own tired, pale reflection, surrounded by nothing but empty space. When the doors opened on Deck 9, I stepped out into the main buffet area. It was completely deserted. The long food stations were locked down tightly behind heavy metal pull-down shutters. The dining chairs were all flipped upside down and stacked neatly on top of the tables. The bright fluorescent lights from the daytime were turned off, leaving only a few dim emergency lights glowing softly near the emergency exits. I walked out through the automatic glass doors onto the open pool deck. The sudden blast of the ocean wind was freezing against my skin. The sky was pitch black, merging perfectly with the dark water below to create a terrifying, endless wall of darkness. The massive ship felt entirely isolated out here, like a ghost ship floating in the middle of a massive, black void. I walked over to a nearby hydration station and filled a plastic cup with ice water. I stood near the railing for a moment, letting the freezing wind hit my face. I tried to force my shoulders to drop and relax. I tried to appreciate the rare quiet. But then that familiar, creeping feeling returned. It was the exact same feeling I had experienced in the dining hall earlier that afternoon. The sudden, intense sensation of being watched by someone you cannot see. I slowly turned around to look at the rows of empty white deck chairs. The blue underwater glow from the main swimming pool cast strange, shifting shadows across the wooden deck. I scanned the upper passenger balconies and the darkened, tinted windows of the bridge. I couldn't see anyone. Nothing was moving except the water sloshing back and forth in the pool, but my body was completely tense. My heart started beating a little faster in my chest. I didn't want to stay out there for another single second. The massive open space suddenly felt just as terrifying and dangerous as my cramped cabin. I threw the plastic cup into a nearby trash can and began power walking back to the glass doors. I hurried back to the elevator and violently pressed the button for deck 2, desperate to get back to the safety of my locked room. The ride down felt even longer than the ride up. When the doors opened back onto the bottom deck, I stepped out and hurried down the endless, quiet hallway. I kept my head down, not wanting to look at the identical doors or the dizzying carpet. I reached my cabin, quickly swiped my keycard, and pushed the heavy door open. I slipped inside and immediately threw the deadbolt. I leaned my back against the solid metal door, taking a deep, shaky breath. The familiar, tiny room finally felt safe again. The locked door was a barrier between me and whatever was making me feel so incredibly paranoid. I took off my shoes, placed my keycard on the desk, and climbed back into bed. I pulled the heavy blankets all the way up to my chin, hoping that the cold walk had exhausted me enough to finally fall asleep. I closed my eyes, and that was exactly when the noises started. I heard a slow, heavy scraping sound. It sounded exactly like a heavy wooden chair being dragged slowly across a hard, uncarpeted floor. The harsh sound echoed clearly through the quiet, dark room. It sounded like it came from directly above me. At first, I just felt a flash of annoyance. I opened my eyes and stared blindly at the dark ceiling. I figured someone in the cabin upstairs was drunk and moving furniture around in the middle of the night. It was rude, but not exactly scary. But then my tired brain caught up with the reality of the situation. I remembered the ship's layout perfectly. I had memorized the pocket map on the very first day, so I wouldn't get lost on the massive vessel. There were no passenger cabins directly above my section of the hallway. Deck 3 directly above me was the main dining room. I had just been near that area. The dining room was completely locked down and empty for the night. More importantly, the entire dining room was fully carpeted with thick, plush rugs. You couldn't drag a chair on that floor and produce a harsh, scraping sound if you tried. I sat up in bed, my heart instantly starting to pound hard against my ribs. I held my breath and listened closely. The loud scraping sound happened again. A slow, agonizing drag that lasted for 3 full seconds. That is when the terrible reality fully hit me. The sound wasn't coming from upstairs. It wasn't coming through the ceiling from the deck above. It was coming from the air vent. The large, rectangular metal vent was located on the wall just a few feet above the foot of my bed. The scraping sound was vibrating and echoing through the metallic ductwork. I froze completely. I didn't make a single sound. I just stared into the pitch-black darkness, trying to locate the exact source of the terrifying noise. Then the heavy scraping stopped. It was immediately replaced by a different sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It sounded exactly like someone was lightly drumming their bare fingers against the inside of the thin metal vent. Felt physically sick. My stomach dropped entirely. I pulled my knees tight against my chest, barely taking in any air. I had no idea what to do. Should I call ship security? Was it just a loose piece of metal rattling in the wind outside? Was the massive engine causing a strange vibration in the pipes? I tried desperately to convince myself there was a normal, logical explanation. Ships make weird noises all the time. The metal expands and contracts in the cold ocean. It had to be normal. I was just starting to calm my racing heart down when the silence was shattered completely. The phone rang. It was an old, heavy beige telephone mounted on the wall right next to the tiny desk. The ringtone was incredibly loud and harsh. It echoed violently in the small, enclosed space, making me physically jump in the bed. A bright red light on the base of the phone began flashing rapidly with every ring, casting an eerie, pulsing red glow across the dark walls of the cabin. I just sat there on the mattress, staring at the flashing red light, completely paralyzed with shock. Who could possibly be calling an interior cabin at nearly 4 a.m? The phone kept ringing. 5 times, 6 times, it clearly wasn't going to stop. I slowly threw off the heavy blankets and stepped onto the cold floor. My legs felt weak and shaky beneath me. I crossed the small room and reached out for the receiver. The plastic felt freezing cold against my sweaty palm. I picked it up and held it tightly to my ear. I didn't say anything at first. I just listened to the faint, crackling static on the line. "Hello?" a tired, flat voice asked. It was a woman's voice. I swallowed hard, trying to force my throat to work. "Hello," I whispered back. "Is this cabin 2014? The woman asked, sounding completely bored. "Yes," I replied, my voice shaking noticeably now. "This is the late-night galley service," the woman said. "Did you just call down to place an order?" I frowned in the dark, deep confusion, temporarily replacing some of my blind terror. No, I didn't call anyone. I was trying to sleep. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, echoing clatter of metal dishes in the background of her end. "Are you entirely sure, ma'am?" the woman asked, sounding slightly irritated now. "I just received a call from your exact cabin extension about 10 minutes ago. Someone ordered a turkey sandwich, a side of fruit, and a black coffee. They were extremely specific about the order." A wave of cold, heavy dread washed over me instantly. I gripped the plastic phone tighter, my knuckles turning completely white. "I am absolutely sure," I said, my voice rising in genuine panic. "I am the only person inside this room. I live alone. I have been alone all night. My name is Sarah Whitman, and I did not call you." The woman sighed softly through the speaker. "All right, ma'am, I apologize for waking you up. It must just be a glitch in the ship's phone routing system. It happens occasionally with the older models down on deck 2. Disregard the order. Have a good night." Before I could ask her anything else, she hung up the phone. The line went totally dead, leaving only a hollow, buzzing dial tone in my ear. I slowly placed the heavy receiver back onto the wall cradle. The room was completely silent again. The terrifying tapping sound in the metal vent had stopped, but the fear twisting inside my stomach was worse than ever before. A glitch, that is what the galley worker had casually called it. A glitch in the system, but my terrified mind couldn't accept that excuse. A glitch might cause a phone system to randomly dial a wrong number, but a computer glitch doesn't verbally order a specific turkey sandwich and a black coffee. A human being does that. Someone had intentionally called the kitchen and pretended to be inside my locked room. I backed away from the wall phone and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. I felt completely exposed and incredibly vulnerable. Whoever had called the kitchen obviously knew my cabin number. Did they know my actual name too? Were they the exact same person making those horrible, dragging noises in the air vent just moments before? I stared blindly at the heavy metal door, willing it with all my strength to stay closed. I silently prayed for the morning sun to finally rise, even though I wouldn't be able to see it inside this windowless box. About 5 minutes passed in agonizing, heavy silence. I was just starting to convince myself that it was all an elaborate prank. I tried to tell myself it was just some drunk teenagers on another deck messing with the public house phones. Then I heard it, 3 heavy, deliberate knocks on my cabin door. Boom, boom, boom. It wasn't a polite, quick service industry knock. It was low, slow, and incredibly forceful. It sounded exactly like someone was hitting the bottom half of the metal door with the side of their heavy fist. I stopped breathing completely. Every single muscle in my body locked up tight. I didn't dare move a single inch from the bed. 10 agonizing seconds passed. Nothing happened. The room remained perfectly still. Then 3 more knocks. Boom, boom, boom. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt like they were made of solid lead. I slowly crept across the small room, placing my bare feet carefully onto the carpet to avoid making any sound at all. I approached the metal door and pressed my eye tightly against the small glass peephole. The fisheye lens heavily distorted the view of the hallway, curving the walls and stretching the ugly geometric carpet pattern into a weird blur. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the corridor outside. The hallway was completely empty. There was no one standing directly in front of my door. I looked as far as the curved lens would allow, looking down both sides of the incredibly long corridor. There was absolutely no movement. There were no dark shadows stretching across the floor. There was just an endless row of closed, identical doors. I stepped back from the door, my heart hammering violently in my throat. Had they knocked and immediately run away? Or were they currently hiding just out of sight, pressing their body flat against the wall where the tiny peephole couldn't see them? I stood there for what felt like an absolute eternity, listening desperately for any sign of movement on the other side of the metal barrier. I heard nothing, not a scrape against the wall, not a muffled footstep on the carpet, not even a heavy breath. Slowly and incredibly carefully, I reached out and unlocked the heavy deadbolt. The lock clicked loudly in the quiet room. I turned the brass handle and cracked the heavy door open just a single inch. I peered out into the brightly lit, empty hallway. Still no one. I pushed the door open a little wider and looked straight down at the floor. Sitting perfectly centered on the small welcome mat directly in front of my door was a silver room service tray. I stared at the tray in absolute disbelief. The large tray had a shiny metal dome covering a plate in the center. Right next to the metal dome was a white ceramic mug, with faint steam slowly rising from the dark coffee inside. My hands were shaking violently as I reached down and grabbed the thick edges of the tray. I didn't want to leave it out in the hallway. I felt a desperate, overwhelming need to get it inside and close the door immediately. I pulled the heavy tray quickly into the room and kicked the heavy door shut with my bare foot. I instantly threw the deadbolt back into place, locked the handle, and fastened the small metal chain lock at the very top. I even dragged the small wooden desk chair over and wedged it tightly under the door handle for extra security. I carried the tray over to the small desk and set it down carefully. My breathing was incredibly shallow and uneven. I just stared at the shiny metal dome for a long, terrible moment. I really didn't want to know what was under it. My panicked imagination was running wild with terrifying, horrible possibilities. I slowly reached out and lifted the cold metal cover off the plate. Underneath, sitting neatly on a plain white ceramic plate, was a perfectly normal turkey sandwich. Beside it was a small white bowl filled with freshly sliced fruit. It was exactly what the kitchen worker had calmly described to me over the phone. I let out a very shaky breath, feeling a confusing, messy mix of relief and intense dread washing over me. It was just normal food. Someone had actually ordered the real food and had it physically sent to my room. It absolutely had to be a stupid, elaborate prank. Then I finally noticed the small piece of paper tucked neatly under the edge of the warm coffee mug. It was a standard, slightly faded printed receipt from the ship's galley. The cheap paper was slightly damp from the condensation of the hot mug. I pulled the paper out and held it up to the dim, yellowish light of the bedside lamp. At the very top of the receipt, printed in bold black ink, were the words, "Passenger, Sarah Whitman, Cabin 2014. My stomach completely dropped. They knew my full, real name. You don't just guess a full first and last name and perfectly match it to a cabin number by pure accident. Whoever did this had intentionally targeted me specifically. They had either looked me up on a manifest or they had been following me closely. But that wasn't even the worst part. At the very bottom of the printed receipt, located just beneath the printed order total, someone had written something by hand in thick, sloppy black pen. The handwriting was incredibly rushed and jagged, the heavy ink tearing slightly into the damp paper. The handwritten note simply said, "You didn't answer the first time." I stared at those terrifying words until my vision blurred completely. My panicked mind raced frantically, trying desperately to piece together what that simple sentence actually meant. The first time. What did they mean by the first time? Did they mean the phone call? Had they tried to call my room earlier while I was out on my walk and I simply wasn't there to answer it? Or did they mean the door? Had they come down to my cabin earlier in the night, knocked heavily on the metal, and waited out in the darkness of the hallway? Had they stood right outside my door while I was tossing and turning in bed, silently listening to me breathe through the crack? And when I didn't answer the door, had they gone to a public house phone, ordered the specific food under my name, and used the room service delivery as an excuse to finally force me to open the door? The terrifying thought made me physically nauseous. I dropped the damp receipt right onto the tray and backed away quickly until my legs hit the side of the bed. I collapsed onto the soft mattress, pulling my knees extremely tight against my chest. I stared endlessly at the locked door, horrified by the realization that whoever wrote that awful note was highly likely the exact same person who had just knocked. And they were probably still standing out there in the empty, silent hallway, staring intensely at my door, knowing that I had just opened it and taken the tray inside. The heavy silence in the room stretched out, feeling incredibly thick and completely suffocating. The low hum of the ship's engine vibrated violently beneath me, feeling far more sinister than ever before. Then, the silence broke again. The beige telephone on the wall suddenly started ringing. The harsh, aggressive sound completely tore through the quiet room. The bright red light began flashing rapidly again, casting its awful warning glow across my terrified face. I didn't jump this time. I was entirely paralyzed by pure fear. I just sat on the bed, staring blankly at the phone, watching the red light pulse. 4 rings, 5 rings, 6 rings. It clearly wasn't stopping. They were waiting patiently for me to answer. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt completely numb and disconnected from my body. I slowly walked over to the wall, my hand trembling violently as I finally reached out for the heavy receiver. I lifted it very slowly and brought the cold plastic right up to my ear. I didn't say hello. I didn't make a single sound. I just held my breath completely and listened. There was absolutely no background noise on the other end of the line, no clattering dishes, no crackling static from the kitchen. There was only a heavy, wide-open silence. Then I heard it clearly. It was the faint, highly rhythmic sound of breathing. It was deep, slow, and incredibly calm. "Who is this?" I whispered quietly, my voice breaking completely on the words. The calm breathing immediately stopped. There was a very sharp, quiet click, and then the line went completely dead, leaving only the hollow, endless, terrifying drone of the dial tone echoing in my ear. I slowly hung up the phone and backed far away into the darkest corner of the tiny cabin. I did not sleep for the rest of the night. I didn't even move a muscle. I just sat on the floor, wrapped tightly in a blanket, staring unblinking at the wooden chair wedged firmly under the door handle. I nervously listened to every single creak of the metal hull and every subtle shift of the engine, absolutely terrified that the heavy, dragging sound would start up in the air vent again. It never did. I stayed completely frozen in that exact position until my phone clock finally read 7:30 a.m. I knew the ship would be fully waking up by then. I knew the long hallways would finally be filling with loud families heading upstairs to eat breakfast. Only then did I finally find the courage to move the heavy chair, unlock the deadbolt, and step cautiously outside. The hallway looked perfectly normal. The bright fluorescent lights were fully turned on. A friendly cabin steward was slowly pushing a loud cleaning cart just a few doors down. Everything looked completely ordinary and safe, as if the absolute terror of the previous night had never even happened. I immediately walked straight to guest services and demanded to change my cabin. I made up a lie about a badly leaking pipe in the bathroom. They quickly moved me up to a much higher deck, into a room that actually had a window. I never went back down to deck 2 for the rest of the trip. I spent the remaining 3 days of the long cruise constantly looking over my shoulder in a state of deep paranoia. I actively avoided the buffet area entirely. Every single time a random stranger looked at me for a second too long, my heart would instantly start pounding. I never found out who placed the room service order. I never found out who knocked heavily on my door or called my room phone. The ship's security team simply claimed they couldn't accurately trace calls that were made from the public house phones. If you ever found a handwritten note like that outside your door in the middle of the ocean, how would you have handled the situation? So drop your theories below in the comments.